Chapter 443. Li Tianlan stood in the light. Black Ghost stood in the darkness. In the blurred darkness, his expression was as if he had seen a ghost. Black Ghost himself was a ghost. So at this moment, seeing Li Tianlan's sword, Black Ghost even felt more terrible than seeing a living ghost. When he turned around and pulled out the knife with all his strength, he thought of many possibilities. Moreover, he was prepared for every possibility. But in any case, he did not expect to see Li Tianlan's sword. Unprecedented fear rose from his heart. In a dark environment, the light was clearly reflected in his sight. This was an indescribable sword light. Pure, bright, dazzling. Pure with almost no impurities. The turbulent darkness around continued to converge toward the light. A misty light swallowed the darkness, slowly spread, and completely wrapped Li Tianlan. There was nothing in the misty and bright sword light. At this moment, Li Tianlan didn't even have killing intent. The misty sword energy was slowly gathering. There was only light. Pure light. Inside the light, it was calm. Li Tianlan stood in the light curtain and looked at the darkness outside. The expression on his pale face was equally calm. Outside the light curtain, there was a monstrous killing intent. Black Ghost's face was full of fear and even despair. But he took the initiative to pull out the knife to fight back. This knife could not be turned back at all. In his sight, the sword light around Li Tianlan had stopped spreading. The light outlined a perfect circle in the darkness. The light reflected everything. Li Tianlan stood in the light, like standing in a mirror, as if he did not belong to this world. Black Ghost's knife light rushed over. His body also rushed over. After this knife, Black Ghost did not know what the end would be. But he was sure that if he did not use this knife, he would die. A desperate situation of life and death. This was a real no choice. Forward. He could only move forward. At the moment when light and darkness intertwined, Black Ghost suddenly let out a long howl like a beast. His eyes were filled with a strange red light for a moment. As the light and darkness were getting closer and closer, Black Ghost's knife momentum suddenly changed from a sweep to the most overbearing vertical cut. Blood burst out of Black Ghost's body at the moment when he forcibly reversed the knife momentum. Black Ghost's breath was instantly weak, but the knife light in the darkness became more and more crazy. He wanted a chance to fight back. Li Tianlan gave him the opportunity. But when Black Ghost seized this opportunity, he realized that he had a chance. But only once. If he couldn't kill Li Tianlan with this strike, there would be no future. So the Black Ghost burned everything. All the power, all the potential. As long as he could live, even if he was severely injured or even dropped in cultivation, it was not something he could not accept. The pure sword light was absorbing the darkness. Wherever the pitch-black saber light passed, the space would shatter inch by inch. A pitch-black arc of light that was several tens of meters long appeared in the pitch-black castle. The arc of light descended from above like a black lightning, crazily striking the pure sword light around Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan still maintained the posture of holding the sword with both hands. He raised his head quietly and looked at the knife light and Black Ghost jumping out of the darkness. The pitch-black arc of light collided with the pure sword light. The crazy and ruthless sharpness and killing intent tore at the pure mirror-like light at all costs. The light around Li Tianlan fluctuated violently, like boiling water, like a sudden surging tide. The collision of light and darkness spread around, and the obscure light penetrated the walls and the ceiling. With the position of the two as the center, everything within hundreds of meters of the castle turned into a piece of powder in an instant. The pitch-black saber light cut the light curtain around Li Tianlan wildly. Black Ghost had completely put down everything and madly slashed. Killing. Extinction. Annihilation. All the unique skills seemed to become the most common moves in his hands. Countless blood spurted out from his body as he waved his saber. Black Ghost howled miserably. Wherever the saber light passed, the pure sword light had been completely surrounded by dense black arcs of light. Li Tianlan's pure mirror-like sword light had been completely distorted, but in the face of Black Ghost's desperate attack, the light curtain had never been broken. Invincible! The light screen was so pure that it didn't have any sword chi or killing intent. This sword was pure light and didn't have any attack power, but it represented absolute defense. Black Ghost waved his saber wildly, and he didn't even know how many times he had waved. In fact, the first few sabers almost exhausted all Black Ghost's strength. The later countless sabers, the more powerful they were, the less powerful they were. The final few sabers were not even at the fire-flaming realm. But Black Ghost still persistently waved the weapon in his hand. His body was trembling. Looking at the unbreakable light curtain, his eyes had gradually become dull. His movements were getting slower and slower. But with his movements, the thin and somewhat ridiculous saber light was constantly waving, and the light curtain around Li Tianlan had been distorted to the limit. The dull sound of air bursting rang out. Pieces of pure light began to collapse. The entire light screen shattered, and countless light dots danced in the air as they rushed into the darkness, disappearing in an instant. There was no excitement in Black Ghost's eyes. Instead, he became extremely desperate. Sure enough, it was this sword. Unexpectedly, it was really this sword. Li Tianlan held falling stars with both hands, and the blade turned calmly. It was as if he had passed through a mirror that reflected light. In an instant, the light receded. The same pure silence and darkness without any impurities suddenly broke out in front of Li Tianlan. The sword energy rose to the sky and destroyed everything. Unparalleled style. Two completely different sword intents were the most complete, unparalleled style. The pure light represented absolute defense, and pure darkness was the ultimate destruction. Boom! In the dark silence, there was a sudden earth-shattering explosion. The darkness completely swallowed Li Tianlan. The place where he was like an exploding black hole. The darkness, which was enough to swallow any light, burst out completely in an instant like a surging tsunami. Black Ghost was drowned. The broken castle hall was drowned. The open-air garden was drowned. The power of extreme destruction seemed to be endless, filling the castle in the blink of an eye. All the sounds of bursting and collapsing turned into a loud noise at the same time. Standing in this mountain area, Rekvia Castle, known as the strongest war fortress in Eastern Europe, completely collapsed in the sudden outbreak of the black tide. The pure dark sword intent rushed out of the castle, obscuring the starlight, mighty. Li Tianlan stood in the very center of the darkness, his body trembling violently. At this point, the gene potion he had taken before finally lost its effect with his full strength. The injury from the battle with Jiang Qianyan. The injury from the battle with Jiang Qiansong. The injury from the joint attack of Black Ghost and Jiang Qiansong. The internal and external injuries, every wound was gushing blood. The injury began to bite back at the body like never before. Li Tianlan's eyes turned black. His body shook, and he tried his best to concentrate his will and not let himself fall to the ground. The blood completely dyed his broken white cloud silk clothes red. Li Tianlan, covered with blood and dust, looked like a beggar. But in the darkness, his whole person was full of unprecedented majesty. Because after the darkness dissipated, the African Black Ghost, who was strong enough to be on the holy list, was kneeling in front of him in the most humiliating way. The dark sword intent completely wiped out all his vitality. The sword light passed through every inch of his body. Every muscle on his body was completely torn by the sword intent, and even his internal organs had become fragmented. The vitality kept disappearing in his body. His body trembled. Before he died, he didn't even feel fear, just obvious doubts and puzzlement. Why? Black Ghost struggled to raise his head. He seemed to realize how humiliating his posture was. He tried to move and seemed to want to turn over. Bang! In the subtle sound, one of his slightly exerted arms suddenly exploded. The blood mist flew and scattered on Black Ghost. Black Ghost's face was completely distorted, but his eyes were fixed on Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and looked at Black Ghost. This was the first time he had killed an invincible realm expert with his own strength. It was not the outbreak of life that he gave up in Heaven Capital. No one paid the price. He also paid the price. The dual wind and thunder veins had become dual veins of wind and thunder. The imperfect, unparalleled style was destined to be difficult to appear for a long time. His injury had reached the limit, and then he needed careful nursing, but he killed an invincible realm expert. So Li Tianlan was now in the mood to chat with Black Ghost. Why what? His voice was hoarse and weak. The Chosen One. The road of the Chosen One. Illusion and reality. Why is there light and darkness? Why can it be at the same time, at the same time? He tried to gasp to express his meaning. For nearly 500 years in the Dark World, the Li family and the Wang family of Beihai had been standing at the peak of the Dark World. The 24 moves of sword and the 6 paths of reincarnation represented the extreme of swordsmanship and the extreme of martial arts. Above the extreme was the real road of the Chosen One. So there were only 2 ways to become the Chosen One in the Dark World. Many experts in the Dark World knew what this was, but they might not be able to do it. The sword intent of the 24 moves of sword reached the extreme. Beyond the extreme, it was the sword intent of reality and illusion. It was sharp and unparalleled, destroying everything. The road of the 6 paths of reincarnation surpassed the extreme, which was light and darkness. This was the strongest outbreak, and it was a 2-sided outbreak. Light was the ultimate defense, and darkness was the absolute destruction. Between day and night, the attack power and defense power of the outbreak almost doubled. These were the only 2 roads of the Chosen One that could be seen in the Dark World. The Jiang family of South America was not qualified to take such a road. However, Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost joined forces with the help of the domain of 30-meter mortal world, combining defense and attack, and they could infinitely close to this point. That was infinitely close to perfection. This was also the reason why the Jiang family of South America was full of confidence in Eastern Europe. When Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost joined forces, they could almost fight against the experts at the peak of the invincible realm, because they represented an incomparably perfect road. And now, Li Tianlan. After the sword intent of reality and illusion, the move of unparalleled just now, the alternation of light and darkness, the conversion of day and night, was clearly another road of true perfection. Why? Black Ghost muttered to himself, still persistent. 2 roads of the Chosen One, reality and illusion, light and darkness. Why did Li Tianlan frowned? What nonsense is this? He glanced at Black Ghost and said, martial arts is martial arts. What's the use of these fancy things? His body moved and he took a step forward. This step seemed to destroy the balance of the whole space. The darkness of nothingness surged over and completely wrapped Black Ghost. Black Ghost opened his mouth, only uttered a syllable, and the whole person was completely swallowed by the darkness. His figure broke up little by little in the darkness, turned into flesh and blood, and turned into dust. Black Ghost died. At the same time, Li Tianlan began to bleed all over. The blood washed the dust on his body, extremely red and mournful. He knelt on the ground, dizzy, and could hardly stand up for a while. No one could have predicted that this would be the result of this battle. The invincible realm died. The Chosen One was bathed in blood. Li Tianlan clenched his fists and struggled to stand up. In the darkness, his voice sounded low, very hoarse, but very firm. I also have a sword. Chapter 444. Xianxia state was still silent. It was still noisy on the international stage. The meeting of the United Nations had long since ended, but great pressure was still surging toward Xianxia state. From morning to night, this was destined to be an abrupt and subtle day. Wulan state, Oga state, and Ross state completely fell out with Xianxia state. All the major powers in the world exerted pressure on Xianxia state. The turbulent day gradually came to an end. Countless conspiracies were brewing in a frenzied and noisy atmosphere. Only a few people found that in this general trend, Wulan state, Oga state, and Ross state, which should have been the most excited, were suddenly silent. They became as silent as Xianxia state. Since the evening, the spokespersons of the 3 countries had never made any remarks against Xianxia state, because they had lost contact with Schenker, the patriarch of the Rekvia family. The Rekvia castle was very close to Reki city. In the shortest time since the battle in the castle, the high-level officials of Wulan state had already received the news. It was a chaotic battle on the satellite's surveillance screen. Jiang Qiansong, Black Ghost, Li Tianlan, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud, countless experts of the Rekvia family, Dark Swordmaster Qin Shilai. In the light and shadow that filled the whole scene, most of the high-level officials of Wulan State were watching this scene in silence. They did not see Shenkar, the patriarch of the Rekvia family. But they saw Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost attacking the Rekvia castle. In the high-level conference room of Reki City, every high-level official of Wulan State who saw this scene felt a little strange. No matter what the situation was, at least now it seemed that Rekvia had changed its camp and stood in Li Tianlan's camp. What an embarrassing situation this was. 12 hours ago, Wulan State had taken the initiative to declare war on Zhongzhou State. If Rekvia joined the camp of Zhongzhou State, how could Wulan State deal with itself? The declaration of war between Wulan State and Zhongzhou State was the result of the strong influence of the Rekvia family. In capitalist countries, capital itself had unimaginable magic and power. The entire Rekvia family was a huge monster entrenched in the 5 Eastern European countries. Their capital controlled all the important industries in several countries. Countless parliamentarians, generals, and senior officials kept in touch with them. All the media spoke for them. It was no exaggeration to say that as long as the Patriarch of Rekvia wanted to, he could easily resound throughout the 5 Eastern European countries with a cough. Wulan State might have the power to resist Rekvia, but the government of Wulan State did not. Shenkar ordered Wulan State to declare war on Zhongzhou State. As long as someone did not execute it, whether it was the president or the prime minister, they would be ousted the next day. This was the power of capital. That was why the senior officials of Wulan State felt embarrassed. In less than 24 hours after the country declared war with Zhongzhou State, Rekvia shook hands with Zhongzhou State. How would Wulan State face Zhongzhou State? Every senior executive was silent, and the atmosphere in the conference room was as stiff as ice. Many people here were related to the Rekvia family, and some even came from the Rekvia family. But from their political standpoint, no matter what relationship they had with Rekvia, everyone felt ashamed when they thought of the situation after Rekvia shook hands with Zhongzhou State. The communication screen in the conference room suddenly changed. An old general with a grizzled beard appeared on the screen, his expression solemn and dignified. All the higher-ups focused their attention on him at the same time. The old general saluted with a solemn face, took a deep breath, and slowly said, "Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, the Grand Duke of England, the Queen of the Shadow Throne of the European Union, King Tong Rothschild, requests to enter Reki City." The president of Wulan State, whose expression was calm and almost numb, did not speak. The prime minister on the side was slightly shocked. Rothschild was the top wealthy family in Europe, which was enough to keep pace with the Wang family of Beihai. Such a family dominated the United Kingdom and had been Grand Dukes for generations. In this generation, the title of Grand Duke fell on King Tong of Rothschild. She was not the Patriarch of Rothschild. But the title of Queen of the Shadow Throne and Grand Duke of Rothschild was enough to show that at this moment, Rothschild and the Shadow Throne, which could be said to be supreme in Western Europe, had set their sights on Reki City at the same time. There was a long silence. The communication never hung up. After an unknown period of time, a noise suddenly sounded from the screen. Another voice sounded on the screen. It was also a report, but it sounded from the old general's communication device. The old general did not block the call, so the news reported to the old general was directly transmitted to the ears of all the high-level officials of Wulan State. Report, General, His Highness Angel, the Holy Virgin of the Vatican, His Highness Mellad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, and His Highness Chaos, the Grand Knight of Knights Templars, request to enter Reki City. The old general on the screen froze for a moment, then looked at the high-level officials in the conference room and fell silent. There was a sound of rapid breathing in the depressing conference room. The president, who was expressionless, moved his body, glanced at the old general, and nodded slightly. The old general hesitated, nodded slightly, picked up the communication device, and said in a deep voice, "Let them go. It seems that the situation is not that bad." The president, who had been silent for a long time, smiled, and his smile was a little self-deprecating. The Snowdance Corps, the Jiang family of South America, the Qin clan of Eastern Europe, Rothschild, the Vatican, and Knights Templars. In a small place like Wulan State, there were 6 major forces involved in the competition in a day, plus the local rekvia of Wulan State. The situation was extremely chaotic. But we always have to find someone to cooperate with, the president of Wulan State said slowly. Before the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the entire Dark World in Eastern Europe was controlled by the Polar Ground Alliance. The Polar Ground Alliance was controlled by the 4 major families in Eastern Europe. The 4 families, who controlled countless interests, transferred the interests of the Dark World to the countries in Eastern Europe. Therefore, when the Polar Ground Alliance existed, the countries in Eastern Europe did not worry about the war in the Dark World. But now that the Polar Ground Alliance had collapsed, Wulan State, which was controlled by rekvia, suddenly seemed extremely fragile. Under such circumstances, Wulan State must find a dark force to cooperate with, just like East Island chose the Purgatory of Heaven capital at the beginning. The war in the Dark World was sometimes very huge and sometimes very small. But it was undeniable that every large-scale conflict in the Dark World was extremely sensitive. The focus of the Dark World's competition was basically related to the fate of the country. No country dared to let an uncontrolled Dark World develop unscrupulously in its own territory. Therefore, many countries had only 2 choices in the face of foreign forces, either to expel or to cooperate. In the case of the latter, it was usually because these countries did not have enough power to carry out the expulsion. This was the last resort. Wulan State's geographical location was extremely important, and it had always been a battleground for military forces. More than 20 years ago, Zhongzhou State established the Arctic Ocean Command, and the best target was Wulan State. At that time, the Li family of Zhongzhou State was like the sun at high noon, and the 2 highnesses were invincible. With the full support of Zhongzhou State and the assistance of the Wang family of Beihai, the Arctic Ocean Command experienced countless wars before and after its establishment. The Li family, which had countless chips, encountered the unified rejection and resistance of all the European powers and wealthy families in Eastern Europe, including Rothschild. In the end, the Li family still opened up a situation in Eastern Europe and established the Arctic Ocean Command. But there was no room for the Li family to intervene in the 5 Eastern European countries with Wulan State as the core. Wulan State was a large European country, rich in all kinds of resources and a world-famous granary. Its location determined its importance. Between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, Wulan State was the most important focus and the most natural channel. Moreover, the coastline of Wulan State could go straight to Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and East Asia. It was no exaggeration to say that if Zhongzhou State had occupied this place back then, it would have contained the throat of the entire Europe. The major powers in Western Europe were not interested in the Arctic Ocean Command in Eastern Europe. They just did not want the Li family to occupy Wulan State and pose too much threat to themselves in their rear. In fact, they did. The Arctic Ocean Command was established. The Li family withdrew from Eastern Europe. However, the entire Arctic Ocean Command in Eastern Europe was completely cut off by several countries around Wulan State. For more than 20 years, its deterrent was still seriously insufficient. Now the Polar Ground Alliance had collapsed, and Zhongzhou State had made a comeback. It was still the Li family, and it was still as chaotic as before. But the current Li family was not as good as it was in the past. At present, any superpower that entered Wulan State was fully interested in cooperating with Wulan State. Wulan State could choose Zhongzhou State, Rothschild, the Vatican, and the Jiang family of South America, but everything was just in theory. In such a chaotic situation, if Wulan State, which was not strong in comprehensive national strength, rashly chose, it would only bring disaster to itself. The president thought silently and suddenly broke the silence in the conference room. Reki City opens all the city defenses. There was a moment of silence in the conference room, and then it was drowned in an uproar. The president looked at the incredible expressions of many high-level officials and said calmly, "Now Wulan State is the freest, but also the most powerless. We have to cooperate with other forces in any case. In this case, let's open the city defense, let all forces come in, and let them fight. He paused and said flatly, "We will only choose the winner." The communication in the conference room was suddenly connected again. The old general's figure appeared on the screen again. His expression was still serious, but the muscles at the corners of his eyes were constantly trembling at this time. The president looked at him and did not speak. "Everyone," the old general's voice was extremely low, so it sounded very weak. "I've got the news." His voice was like a dying moan. The Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State, Wang Tianzong, has entered Reki City and is currently heading for Rekvia Castle. The uproar in the conference room suddenly became dead silent. Wang Tianzong, the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State, the first on the divine list. Not to mention his Wang family of Beihai. He was alone. For a country with weak national strength like Wulan State, Wang Tianzong alone represented a power that Wulan State could not resist. No one dared to speak. No one in the conference room could see Wang Tianzong. But just by hearing this name, everyone seemed to feel the majesty of a monarch descending from the North Sea to Eastern Europe. The majesty of the Sword Emperor. The Wang family of Beihai also intervened. The president's palm trembled for a moment, and he suddenly asked, "Where is the Snowdance Corps?" "Less than 20 kilometers from Reki City." The old general's tone was heavy. "How are their losses?" The president took a deep breath, and his eyes suddenly became extremely sharp. "More than 2/3 of the 3,000 people have been lost, but they have marched all the way through 6 large elite legions of ours. At present, nearly half of the military of Wulan State has been completely defeated by the Snowdance Corps." The old general said with a wry smile, "It is expected that they will arrive outside Reki City in 40 minutes at most." "President, what should we do?" In the conference room, a hot-tempered senior military official suddenly stood up and asked loudly. The president's tone was low and brief. "At present we can only wait. Everyone, tonight's change may not be enough to determine the future of Eastern Europe, but it is enough to determine the future of Wulan State. We only choose the winner, no matter who it is, so..." He stood up and bowed deeply to all the senior officials in the conference room. "Please support me." Everyone looked at the president, and no one spoke. Everyone understood that the fate of Wulan State depended on the victory or defeat of several major forces. They could do nothing now. After the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the most vulnerable side of Wulan State completely broke out tonight, making every senior official of Wulan State helpless. They could choose. But they could only choose the winner. But there was only one winner. So the so-called choice, in fact, was that they had no choice. Chapter 445. You sat on the boat and watched the scenery. The person who watched the scenery was watching you upstairs. His sight passed through the hazy misty rain of West Lake. The rippling surface of the lake brought about dense mist. The bell rang from the temple not far away. The bell spread in all directions, distant and empty. West Lake in the rain was extremely beautiful. In a trance, all he could see were sceneries. West Lake, Bright Moon Tower. He sat in an elegant private room filled with the fragrance of tea. Through the window, his eyes had been looking at a lonely boat on the lake. The lonely boat was far away from Bright Moon Tower, so far that the lonely boat seemed very small. Because the person on the lonely boat was even smaller. The boat on the water was faintly discernible, drifting aimlessly. A vague figure was sitting on the bow of the boat. He seemed to be fishing, motionless, and looked extremely quiet. In the private room, he watched quietly, picked up the slightly cold tea on the table, and took a sip. The wind suddenly blew outside the window. As the wind passed, it rolled up the hazy misty rain, wrinkled the surface of the lake, and disturbed the leisurely spreading ripples and the lonely boat. The boat swayed in the wind, getting closer to Bright Moon Tower. His hand that was drinking tea paused slightly. Looking at the vague figure fishing on the boat, he narrowed his eyes. It's still too late after all. He put down the teacup and whispered to himself. What's too late? An old voice rang out. The door of the private room was pushed open, and an old man about 60 years old came in. He gently stroked the teacup and did not speak. He did not like to explain, and he did not want to say too much in front of his own people. "What is His Majesty looking at?" the old man asked again. There were only two majesties recognized in the world. One was in the Vatican. The other was in Beihai. Nowadays, only a few people knew that in addition to these two, there was another majesty in the dark world. Almost no one knew his identity and origin, and those who knew would not tell others. So at present, His Majesty was simply a perfect secret figure. He sat in the corner of the private room, and the dim light shrouded his figure. He smiled, knocked on the table, looked at the lake outside the window, and whispered, "I'm watching the night." His voice was calm and indifferent, neither too fast nor too slow, which sounded very magnetic. The old man glanced out of the window blankly. It was raining in Lin, but when night fell in Eastern Europe, it happened to be daytime here. Although the weather was gloomy, how could there be night? The boat on the lake came nearer. Following His Majesty's gaze, the old man finally discovered something. He frowned and suddenly cried out involuntarily, "Wei Kunlun?" He should be a saint. His eyes were steady and firm as he looked at the lake. "The night is too bright." "He is not a threat on the trip to Eastern Europe. You want to kill him?" The old man's eyes were still filled with shock, but the light of contemplation began to surge in the depths of his eyes. "If I go all out," I said, "it's too late." His Majesty shook his head. The old man fell silent. After a while, he shook his head with a wry smile. "I didn't expect that the strongest sword master of Mount Shu would be the first super master of Samsara Palace. There's nothing strange about that. Similarly, no one would have thought that the deputy commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican would be my disciple." His Majesty stood up, poured a cup of tea for the old man, pointed to the opposite side of him, and said casually, "Sit down." The old man sat down and looked seriously at His Majesty's face, which was a little blurred in the shadows. "The disciple is still in the Vatican. Do you really want to get involved in the Vatican?" His Majesty paused, then shook his head with a smile. "Of course not. The Pope is unfathomable, and the Vatican has a transcendent status and powerful strength, but there are too many restrictions. I'm not interested in the Vatican. The reason why the disciple stays there is that he was already there when I found him. In fact, how to let the disciple leave the Vatican is also one of the things I've thought about most in recent years. If this matter is not done well, it may be a problem in the future. The Holy Disarmament Corps has a sensitive position. If you want the disciple to leave the Vatican, you must let him leave the Holy Disarmament Corps first." The old man frowned. "I know." His Majesty said lightly, "Wait until the matter in Eastern Europe is over. Eastern Europe is an opportunity. If possible, I'd like the disciple to kill our sis." The old man raised his eyebrows, looking blank and confused. "Our sis and I had a grudge back then." His Majesty's tone was cold. The corners of the old man's mouth twitched. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. It had been more than 30 years since the Pope of the Vatican was elected. Our sis had been in charge of the Holy Disarmament Corps for more than 20 years. In the state of coronation, our sis could be said to be second only to the Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong, and even comparable to deity. He really didn't know what grudge His Majesty had with our sis. "When I passed by Europe, I wanted to invite their Holy Virgin to dinner. Listen, it was just a meal to discuss some things. There was no other meaning. But our sis thought that I had profaned the inviolable glory of the Holy Virgin. Hey, 2 invincible realm experts and hundreds of advanced saint warriors chased me for nearly 600 kilometers. Of course, I have to remember this." His Majesty sneered, and his tone was full of indifference. The old man hesitated. The disciple was still in the Vatican. He really didn't want to become enemies with the Vatican. If possible, he still hoped that His Majesty could let go of these grudges. "Your Majesty, the Holy Virgin of the Vatican has a very high status in the Vatican. In terms of her identity, she really won't eat alone with a strange man." "What you did," the old man said in a euphemistic tone. "I know." His Majesty interrupted him. "If that's all, I don't want to care about it. You know, I also have faith, although I'm not a Christian. But no one can deny my piety. Do you think that a firm faith will be completely shattered by a powerful force? Absolutely not. The old man shook his head firmly. So, Your Majesty, it's understandable that our sis chased you. I don't understand. His Majesty shook his head and said with a sneer, if a devout faith really can't be defeated, then why didn't I invite their Holy Virgin to dinner back then? But it didn't take long for our sis and the Pope to give their Holy Virgin to another man. The Pope was even willing to preside over their wedding in person and even keep her identity as the Holy Virgin. Huh? A married Holy Virgin? How ridiculous is that? The old man opened his mouth and looked at His Majesty dully. He didn't speak for a long time. He asked the Pope and the commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps to give their Holy Virgin away and even allowed the married Holy Virgin to keep her identity as the Holy Virgin. In the old man's impression, it seemed that there had never been such a powerful and frightening figure in the dark world. This was tantamount to overturning the entire Vatican with his own strength. How insignificant was the Vatican in front of the other party that they would compromise like this? The old man's tone was bitter. It seems that no Holy Virgin of the Vatican has ever married, of course. His Majesty said expressionlessly, the Holy Virgin that they regarded as a treasure had no value in the other party's eyes. The Vatican was willing to marry her, but that person didn't bother to marry her. So in the end, the so-called Holy Virgin still kept her name, but she followed that person for no reason. When I met that person, the so-called Holy Virgin poured me a cup of tea. Holy Virgin. Holy Virgin. He took out a cigarette, slowly lit it, and calmly said, let me tell you a story. Go ahead. The old man's tone was respectful. 20 years ago? Or 30 years ago? There used to be a chosen one in Zhongzhou State. The old man listened in silence, without saying a word. It's just that the chosen one also had a woman he liked. Unfortunately, that year, the Jiang family of South America spent countless resources to kidnap the chosen one's woman. In order to resist the great pressure brought by the chosen one, the Jiang family of South America invited the Pope, Arcis, the Heroes Club, and Fantasy World, several superpowers, intending to fight against the other party together. Just for that woman, His Majesty smiled. That man, who was either a fool or a chosen one, killed all the way from South America to Eastern Europe. He swept the 6 secret bases of the Jiang family of South America and slaughtered nearly 13,000 elites of the Jiang family of South America. Finally, he found the woman in the secret base in Eastern Europe. And then, the old man couldn't help asking, feeling like he was listening to a story. And then, His Majesty said indifferently, 3 invincible realm experts who were strong enough to be on the divine list died on the spot. The entire secret base was in disorder. Thousands of elites were killed. Arcis was seriously injured. The Jiang family of South America suffered heavy losses. As for the Pope, he avoided the chosen one's 5 swords in a row. Finally, he couldn't stand the 6th sword and took the initiative to compromise. Even when the so-called Holy Virgin went to serve tea and warm the bed, he didn't dare to revoke her title. The old man had completely shut up, and his eyes were full of fascination. When the nobility and dignity of the beautiful Holy Virgin were associated with serving tea and warming the bed, some of the reveries in it were enough to stimulate any man, including the old man. Just listen to it as a story. His Majesty put out the cigarette butt and smiled. It's a story. The old man nodded with a hollow smile. Go to Eastern Europe now. His Majesty said calmly, in the chaos of Wulan State, if nothing goes wrong, Li Tianlan will win. Lin Fengting is with Qin Weibai, so it's impossible for the Qin clan not to help Li Tianlan. Jiang Qiansong has no hope of turning the tables, so he will retreat to his secret base in Eastern Europe as soon as possible. I can know the location of the secret base, so there's no reason that Qin Weibai doesn't know. I've sent someone to keep an eye on it. All the manpower is at your disposal. Don't have any conflict with Qin Weibai. There's only one thing you have to do. If Jiang Qiansong can escape from Qin Weibai and Lin Fengting's blockade and make sure that we won't be exposed, save him. I have great use for him. The old man froze and looked at the time. It should be more than 7 o'clock in the evening in Wulan State now. It would take him at least 10 hours to get from Lin and to Wulan State. Is it too late? The old man asked. It's just a casual move. If Jiang Qiansong is lucky, it's naturally too late. If he dies, just follow the original plan. His Majesty shook his head and said calmly, I'll go to Eastern Europe a little later. But to go, I have to determine the state of some people who may affect the situation. As he spoke, his eyes were fixed on Wei Kunlun. Wei Kunlun. No, Saint, he may pose a threat. But for now he has no hope of breaking through and is not a threat. His Majesty shook his head. Who is military counselor? The old man suddenly asked. How do I know? His Majesty asked in reply. Looking at the old man's incredible expression, he smiled and said, I know a lot of things, but it doesn't mean that I'm omniscient and omnipotent. Some things are secrets and they are secrets. How can I know who is military counselor? But Saint is not a threat, and military counselor's current state is not much better. Neither of them is a threat. The old man was silent for a while, then nodded and said, Since the two strongest supermasters of the Samsara Palace are not a threat, who told you that Saint and military counselor are the strongest supermasters of the Samsara Palace? His Majesty said calmly. The old man suddenly froze on the spot. Qin Weibai has contributed a lot to the Samsara Palace's success today. She is an amazing woman, but remember, when she is your enemy, you can't believe everything she says or does. When His Majesty talked about Qin Weibai, there was undisguised appreciation in his eyes. She is an awe-inspiring woman, so I will help her and kill her in the chaos of Eastern Europe. This is the only, maybe not the only one. A low voice suddenly sounded at the door. A middle-aged man in a white shirt with a calm and dignified bearing came in. The old man looked up and was stunned. The middle-aged man was also stunned when he saw the old man. The next second, the two laughed at the same time and shook hands. Secretary Wang, His Majesty greeted him with a smile, Welcome. The person who came to the Bright Moon Tower at such a delicate time was Wang Jinglei, the current member of the decision-making committee of Zhongzhou State, the core member of the Wang family of Beihai, and the top leader of Wuyue Province. Wang Jinglei waved his hand with a smile, sat opposite His Majesty, and said with a smile, We are all on the same side. Why are you so polite? Chapter 446. The idiot called Wang Qinglei Wang Jinglei. It has been changed. Wang Qinglei said that he and His Majesty were on the same side. What everyone knew was that he and the other king were truly on the same side. The rift within the Wang family of Beihai was getting bigger and bigger, and Wang Qinglei was definitely the focus of it. But even so, no one dared to say that Wang Qinglei and Wang Tianzong would completely break up. Even if he finally ascended to the commanding heights of Zhongzhou State and stood at the peak of the highest power in Zhongzhou State, no one thought that Wang Qinglei would have such courage. But today, the ordinary-looking old man looked at Wang Qinglei thoughtfully and then at His Majesty who was sitting in the shadow. An idea suddenly came to his mind. Was the cause, or the starting point, of the rift in the Wang family of Beihai in recent years? It seemed that although His Majesty had been hiding in the dark in recent years, he had done something. Although it was hard to believe that he could do this, the old man knew very well that there were always some people who had advantages that most people would not have in their lives. The old man thought and glanced at His Majesty in the shadow. His Majesty didn't respond. The old man thought about it. Since His Majesty didn't let him go now, he simply sat down beside him. His Majesty's expression was still calm. So Wang Qinglei was completely relieved. Wasn't his saying that he was on the same side as His Majesty? From their current standpoint, he was sure that he and His Majesty were on the same side, but Wang Qinglei was not sure that the old man appeared here. Now he sat down, and His Majesty didn't object, which meant that the other party was indeed on the same side. Wang Qinglei smiled, looked at the calm old man, and said with a smile, General, I didn't expect to see you here. It's an accident and a surprise. He stood up and reached out to the old man. The old man, who was really important in Zhongzhou State but didn't have a strong sense of existence, reached out to hold Wang Qinglei's palm, and said in a hoarse voice, "I didn't expect to see the secretary here either." The secretary was not an ordinary secretary. The general was not an ordinary general either. One of the 4 spirits of Zhongzhou State, Admiral of 9 Serenities, Shang. His code name was Vermilion Bird. In the shadow, His Majesty straightened up and said with a smile, "Secretary Wang, let me introduce you. This is my 3rd follower." Among the 4 spirits of Zhongzhou State, except for Black Tortoise who was still young, the other 3 were the top superiors of the half-step invincible realm in the Dark World. The 2nd commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps of the Vatican. The Sword Sage of East Island. The General of Zhongzhou State. They were all disciples. They were all big spenders. Wang Qinglei shook Shang's old and thin palm hard, looked at His Majesty in the shadow, and smiled peacefully. "It seems that you are going to make a big move in Eastern Europe? Are they targeting Qin Weibai? You seem to have a different opinion?" His Majesty asked with a smile. "It's just an idea." Qin Weibai's charm was unparalleled. Her appearance, temperament, scheming, and wits were all impeccable. It would be a pity to kill such a beautiful woman. If she could become your woman, who would be your opponent in this era? It's much better for you to be with Qin Weibai than for her to be with Li Tianlan. At least in my heart, you and her are truly made for each other. Wang Qinglei said in a gentle voice. His Majesty did not speak for a while. The shadow he was in was a little dim, and Wang Qinglei could see that he was in a trance. This trance passed in a flash, and then it became absolute reason and calmness. "It's impossible." His tone was cold and deep. Wang Qinglei raised his eyebrows. "Even if I can get all the women in the world, I can't get Qin Weibai." His Majesty's tone was complicated. "The world wants to live, but she wants to die." "Why?" Wang Qinglei froze for a moment. "Because of guilt, right?" His Majesty laughed. "Maybe it's also because of deep love? How do I know? She's not an ordinary woman. Everyone has their own world, and everyone's world is wonderful. But maybe only her world is boring. So boring that there's only snow, blood, and Li Tianlan. This is her world, the world she has no face to face." He turned the teacup in his hand and said flatly, "No one can get her. I can't get her, and neither can Li Tianlan. Everything she did in Eastern Europe was a self-destructive plan. When she dies, what's the point of gains and losses? But if," Shang suddenly opened his mouth and said slowly, "what if she knows the existence of your Majesty?" There was no need to assume this question, because Qin Weibai already knew the existence of this Majesty. She will want to survive, because she can't rest assured about Li Tianlan. His Majesty said, "But it's all meaningless. The reason why I appear in her sight at this time is that nothing can be changed. She has done all this. How can she survive under the general trend? At this time, even if she wants to live, she has no chance." "But there will be variables," Wang Qinglei said. "If Qin Weibai survived the chaos in Eastern Europe, it was definitely not a good thing for the people present. I allow variables to exist," His Majesty said, "although it's also very helpless, because I can't grasp the direction of the chaos in Eastern Europe. Qin Weibai will die, but the ending she wants may not necessarily appear. I have to help her, because the new era she wants to create is what I need most. So I simply jumped out." He smiled and turned to look at Shang. "So, when you go to Eastern Europe this time, you must pay attention to a few people." "Go ahead," Shang said calmly. The first is naturally His Majesty Sword Emperor. But with Secretary Wang, you can get a lot of information about His Majesty Sword Emperor, so his threat is the lowest. Shang didn't speak and listened quietly. The second is Qin Weibai. Remember, don't expose your relationship with me under any circumstances. As for the third, Shang still didn't speak. Without His Majesty's words, he knew that the third person His Majesty mentioned was Lin Fengting. It could only be Lin Fengting. It's the Qin clan. His Majesty gave an unexpected answer. The first branch of the Lin clan had a deep foundation in Eastern Europe. Pay attention to the Qin clan's movements, which can even affect the whole situation. The fourth, Shang looked up at His Majesty and thought that the fourth must be Lin Fengting. It's tribulation. Tribulation? Shang and Wang Qinglei were both surprised. Why not Lin Fengting? Lin Fengting is terrible, but some enemies don't have to be defeated. At present, in the chaos in Eastern Europe, the only one who can really sweep everything unscrupulously is His Majesty Sword Emperor, so we need to pay attention to him. Only Qin Weibai can overturn the overall situation quietly, so we also need to pay attention to her. The Qin clan has a deep foundation in Eastern Europe and can't be ignored either. In addition to these three parties, what I've mentioned are those who would rather die to protect Li Tianlan. Tribulation can do this, but his current state should be a little special. When you go to Eastern Europe, you need to send people to stand up to Tribulation and the Holy Virgin Angel of the Vatican. Shang stared silently. He was very old, but at this moment, looking at His Majesty in front of him, he finally thought of a term that belonged to young people. It was a term that his granddaughter would repeat when she played games all day. A cheat. For this era, His Majesty in front of him was a real cheat. And Qin Weibai was also a cheat. The point was that they were all controlled by the cheat in front of them. At this time, the chosen one in Eastern Europe had turned the more terrifying cheat into a woman who could warm his bed. Shang's mind was a little scattered. He couldn't help but think of Eastern Europe and the changes in Reki City. Reki City was changing. But the large mountainous area outside Reki City was still calm. It had just rained, and the night sky was clear and bright, accompanied by the night light. Qin Weibai still stood there quietly, as silent as a statue. Many people had seen Qin Weibai, who was known as a goddess. She was as cold as an otherworldly being. She was arrogant and kept people 1,000 miles away. She was calm and indifferent, but there was a thunderous wisdom in silence. She was calm and composed when she wandered among the top figures in the dark world. She drove the whole Samsara palace to ride the wind and waves in the dark world. Li Tianlan had also seen Qin Weibai's charm and enchanting, which was unknown to outsiders. Only Flaming Fire and Lin Fengting had seen Qin Weibai's silence. When she was silent, she would stand or sit motionless, like a statue. She was not serious, but she gave people a very heavy feeling. It seemed that she was recalling something, thinking about something, and longing for something. At this time, Qin Weibai seemed to unconsciously take off all her clothes. In the moonlight, under the starry sky, she stood there with a kind of unbearable loneliness. It was an indescribable pale emotion that was difficult to describe. It carried the coldest loneliness and despair. Lin Fengting took the initiative to break the silence and said calmly, "We are here. If Jiang Qiansong comes, how likely is it that he will escape?" "I don't know. It depends on Jiang Qiansong's specific injury, but the biggest possibility is no more than 30%. Qin Weibai thought for a moment and said calmly, "Have you ever thought about what if he insists on not compromising?" Lin Fengting laughed. No one was willing to die. That was the truth. But if every invincible realm expert was really afraid of death, it was impossible for him to break through to the invincible realm. Jiang Qiansong was famous for his defense. The Jiang family of South America had developed technology and all kinds of strange defensive equipment. If Jiang Qiansong was unwilling to compromise and fought for the 20% to 30% chance, the possibility was not low. "It may not be very likely that he will compromise with us," Qin Weibai said, "but I prepared a fig leaf for him today." She looked down the mountain. At 7:45 p.m. in Wulan State, Eastern Europe, a white figure slowly came to the secret base of the Jiang family of South America in Eastern Europe. Qin Weibai saw him. He also saw Qin Weibai. Lin Fengting looked at the figure at the foot of the mountain and raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State? Azure Dragon of Zhongzhou State, Gong Sun Qi." As the representative of the neutral forces of Zhongzhou State, there were too many possibilities for the Jiang family of South America to compromise and cooperate with Gong Sun Qi, both now and in the future. Lin Fengting was deep in thought. At the same time, Zhongzhou State, Li. His Majesty looked at Shang in front of him and said calmly, "As for the last one to pay attention to, it is Gong Sun III. Gongsun III? Shang looked blank. Hearing the surname Gongsun, the first thing he thought of was Gongsun Qi. But among the four spirits, Gongsun Qi's strength was definitely the eldest. On the contrary, Shang was absolutely right to be the third. Gongsun III? If it wasn't Gongsun Qi, who was it? I'm used to calling him that. His Majesty laughed at himself and said lightly, "It's Gongsun Qi." The hillside was not high. Gongsun Qi, dressed in white and hiding all the opportunities, soon walked to the top of the hillside. Qin Weibai took the initiative to reach out her hand. Gongsun Qi had a strange look on his face, even a little flattered. Everyone in the dark world knew that the goddess never shook hands with anyone. Tonight, what was going on? "Hello, Boss Qin." Gongsun Qi held Qin Weibai's palm, but he didn't dare to hold it for too long. Things were a little abnormal, so he was even a little vigilant. "Boss Qin, why did you ask me to come here tonight?" "There is indeed one thing," Qin Weibai said softly. "Just say it." Gongsun Qi nodded and looked at Lin Fengting with a calm expression. "It's just a small matter. I hope you can talk to Jiang Qiansong on behalf of Zhongzhou State tonight," Qin Weibai said quietly. Gongsun Qi smiled with some playfulness. Jiang Qiansong? He didn't think about the cause and effect, because Qin Weibai would always explain it. So his question was very straightforward, very straightforward. "What's in it for me?" Qin Weibai hesitated, bowed slightly and said softly, "Third uncle, please help me." "Third uncle?" Gongsun Qi slowly turned around and looked at Qin Weibai. His eyes became extremely deep in an instant. Chapter 447. In Eastern Europe, the famous sword sharpness basically meant invincible sharpness. Qin Shilai, the dark sword master of Eastern Europe, rarely left Eastern Europe. Before the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, Eastern Europe was calm. So almost no one had seen Qin Shilai fight. Even when the Qin clan was in trouble, it was often the Polar Ground Alliance that they supported to solve the problem. The reason why Qin Shilai was ranked first on the Holy List was mostly because he had challenged the Sword Emperor Wang Tianzong 3 times and escaped unscathed. Only a few people knew that this ranking was inflated. This year's ranking on the Divine List was inflated. Li Tunlan, who ranked 9th, directly squeezed Qin Shilai, who should have entered the 15th place on the Divine List, to the Holy List. But even if Qin Shilai was ranked at the bottom of the Divine List, it was still not his strength. Jiang Qiansong was sure of this. The Jiang family of South America had cooperated with Rekvia for a long time. Rekvia's main competitors in Eastern Europe were the other 3 families in Eastern Europe. So the Jiang family of South America had a lot of information about the other 3 families in Eastern Europe. This information was enough to convince Jiang Qiansong that Qin Shilai had long had the strength to enter the Divine List. It was also because of this that Jiang Qiansong wanted to retreat. There was already a usurper in the Rekvia family, and the usurper turned to Li Tianlan. The Qin clan was also on Li Tianlan's side. Qin Shilai stood here with Li Tianlan, with hundreds of elites of Xianyuan sword troop. Jiang Qiansong had to go. Although he felt that he still had a chance of winning, in the current situation, the risk had gradually exceeded the possibility of victory. The shrill whistle pierced the night sky, and Jiang Qiansong became more and more anxious. He really couldn't give up Black Ghost. In the face of Qin Shilai's attack, Jiang Qiansong did not fight back at all and was completely focused on defense. His eyes were always fixed on the broken castle. There was a battle outside the castle. There was also a battle inside the castle. The entire castle looked extremely dilapidated, but it still looked like a huge monster entrenched in the mountainous area. But now, this monster's body was shaking violently. The battle inside the castle spread from the inside to the outside. Large areas outside the castle were constantly collapsing, and smoke and dust were constantly filling the air, almost covering the night sky. Jiang Qiansong had no idea how intense the battle inside was. Should he advance or retreat? Jiang Qiansong began to hesitate like never before. He could feel that Black Ghost did not approach him in the whistle, but was getting farther and farther away from him. This showed that the current Black Ghost had completely lost control of the battle with Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was suppressing Black Ghost. Jiang Qiansong felt that it was ridiculous, but he couldn't help but think about the consequences of this situation. Now his choice was actually very simple. Instead of retreating, he would temporarily get rid of Qin Shilai with the fastest speed and join Black Ghost. The combination of his absolute defense and Black Ghost's absolute attack was the greatest chance of winning tonight's battle. If the two of them didn't fight and joined hands to break out of the encirclement, it was almost certain that they would succeed. But he was not sure what state Black Ghost was under Li Tianlan's suppression. If Black Ghost was seriously injured, he would not advance but retreat. Instead, his last escape route might be blocked. He didn't want Black Ghost to die. But his own survival was the most important thing. Black Ghost was dead, Jiang Qinyan was dead, the Jiang family of South America would directly withdraw from the game in Eastern Europe, and the headquarters would be badly hurt. The consequences were dire. But in such a consequence, if he also died, the Jiang family of South America would not only be badly hurt, but also at the end of the road. Jiang Qiansong knew this very well. So when Black Ghost's battle was already a little bad, Jiang Qiansong didn't know whether he should persist or give up. The sharp sword light became more and more dazzling in front of him. The sword energy rose into the sky. The domain around Jiang Qiansong had been extremely deformed by the tearing. Jiang Qiansong, who was holding up the domain to deal with Qin Shilai's attack, took a step back subconsciously. This step was very small, but it was extremely subtle. As soon as his feet landed, Jiang Qiansong had noticed something wrong. It was an indescribable feeling. It seemed that at this moment, even the surrounding air had solidified, and there was an indescribable danger in all directions. Jiang Qiansong suddenly looked up. The sword light disappeared in his sight. Qin Shilai's figure appeared in his eyes without any cover, extremely clear. It was not only Qin Shilai who was clear. All of a sudden, Jiang Qiansong found that the 100 elites of Xianyuan's sword around him had become extremely clear. Their positions seemed to have moved, but they also seemed to have not moved. The minute change was completely concealed by the frozen silence. Perhaps it was just a single step, but it had already quietly formed an incomparably strange formation. At this moment, in front of the castle, every elite of Xianyuan's sword troop was very clear. Qin Shilai stood in the middle, so clear that he was almost dazzling. Dark Sword Master. Super elite troops. The two sides seemed to be completely connected in an instant, forming a sword formation that could repel and tear everything apart. Jiang Qiansong stood in the center of the sword formation, out of place. The sword of the Lin clan. The sword of the Li family. The sword of the Qin clan. They were of the same origin. This was the most fierce and overbearing sword intent in the Dark World. Surrounded by this kind of sword intent, Jiang Qiansong could only think of 4 words. Those who oppose me will die. The sharp sword began to rise slowly. In an instant, from all directions, all the forces of hundreds of elites of Xianyuan's sword troop involuntarily gathered toward the sharp sword edge. The pressure, as majestic as the sea, roared and filled the world, pressed toward Jiang Qiansong, and finally gathered on the sharp sword edge. Qin Shilai's movements were getting slower and slower, as if he was bearing an unbearable weight. The huge force scattered and gathered, locking Jiang Qiansong in place. Jiang Qiansong could only take this sword strike head-on. It was not until now that he really understood Qin Shilai's plan. All the previous attacks were just to force him to adjust his position. Qin Shilai had never thought of fighting with him. All he wanted was this sword strike. One sword strike to decide the outcome. This was the standard style of the Lin clan. It was also the style of the Li family. Qin Shilai's face turned pale in the gathering of power. The sword formation of Xianyuan's sword troop became more and more perfect. Double digits of thunder-shocking realm experts and dozens of experts at the peak of the fire-flaming realm formed a formation, with invincible realm experts as the core. Even Qin Shilai himself could not bear such a huge force. His figure gradually became illusory and transparent, but the surging power all over the sky continued to gather and turned into the sword intent that flowed wildly. The messy sword light gathered and boiled in Qin Shilai's hands, tearing the sky. In front of Jiang Qiansong, everything had completely disappeared, leaving only the sword light that kept flying in his eyes. The sword light rushed up to the sky and fell to the ground, as if it were outlining something. Vaguely, an indifferent figure appeared in front of Jiang Qiansong, as if it did not exist. The shadow was very vague, and it was even difficult to form a complete outline. But the sword intent all over the sky was completely rioting with the appearance of this shadow. The sword intent flew, as if it was tearing heaven and earth apart. It was an illusory shadow without any charm or even a silhouette. The shadow seemed to be holding a sword in its hand. Amidst the endless light, the sword was simply lifted up. It stabbed straight. It was a simple and slow movement. But at the moment when the sword shadow moved forward, all the sword light instantly gathered in the sword and the shadow. The long sword lit up instantly. The shadow also became clear for a moment. It was a slender, firm, and incomparably sharp figure. Jiang Qiansong seemed to see a golden mask. All of a sudden, Jiang Qiansong felt as if he had fallen into an ice cave. The clear shadow for less than half a second disappeared completely. Qin Shilai's figure appeared in front of Jiang Qiansong. Jiang Qiansong finally recognized this sword move, or the starting gesture of this sword move. The 15th blade, Samsara. This sword move started with the 15th blade. Samsara was the sword intent other than the 24 moves of sword. Under this sword move, all things turned to ashes. Chapter 448. This was the weirdest sword stroke that Jiang Qiansong had ever seen in his life. The 15th blade, Samsara, was the starting move. Everything turned to ashes. The strongest unique skill of the Qin clan. But this sword stroke had no charm, not even much essence. But the moment the sword stabbed forward, there was violent and unparalleled sword intent everywhere between heaven and earth. Under this sword stroke, Jiang Qiansong, who was ranked on the divine list and claimed to have the best defense in the world, sadly found that he could not stop this sword stroke without charm. This was truly an unstoppable sharpness that could cut through anything. Jiang Qiansong could not imagine how terrifying this sword stroke would be in its heyday. He had no time to think about it. The blade of sharpness was straight. It was too fast and too simple. The blade went straight into the night sky, bursting the space. In a trance, all the sword light disappeared completely. There was only a bright blade in front of Jiang Qiansong. The blade without any light or shadow pierced Jiang Qiansong's clothes. The next second, it was death. Jiang Qiansong's eyes widened. In an instant his hair stood on end, and a colorful halo exploded around him one after another. This was a power completely different from martial arts. It was the light of technology. In the dark world, the Wang family of Beihai's gene potion technology was unrivaled and at the world's first-class level. And the individual combat equipment of the Jiang family of South America was also the most advanced in the dark world. Jiang Qiansong was famous for his defense. In any case, he would carry no less than 10 pieces of defensive equipment. These pieces of equipment were inconspicuous. Maybe it was a ring, a bracelet, or a necklace. But at a critical moment, these pieces of equipment could become life-saving things after being triggered. Jiang Qiansong's body was surrounded by layers of hazy halos. The halo of light did not spread outwards. Instead, it tightly wrapped around Jiang Qiansong, looking like layers upon layers of protective shields. The sharpness went straight forward. Hundreds of elites of Xianyuan sword troop around became more and more solemn. Countless flames and thunderbolts turned into sword intent, gathered toward Qin Shilai, and finally disappeared without a trace. However, the silent sword qi on the sharp sword had completely torn apart the sky. The sword qi soared into the sky and swept across the sky and earth. The shield around Jiang Qiansong's body kept twisting and shaking. Colorful halos kept flying around him. Messy metal pieces kept exploding and flying out. The halos were broken layer by layer. The sharp sword qi became stronger and stronger. Vaguely, that blurry silhouette seemed to appear in front of Jiang Qiansong again. That figure seemed to completely overlap with Qin Shilai, with unparalleled sharpness and majesty. The power of over 100 super elites continued to gather. Qin Shilai stabbed forward with all his strength. Under this sword, Qin Shilai could only think of the simplest ending. Jiang Qiansong must die. Jiang Qiansong's eyes gradually became filled with despair. The ending he thought of was exactly the same as Qin Shilai's. Kacha. Just as the last layer of the shield was about to dissipate, a clear cracking sound suddenly rang out. Jiang Qiansong was stunned. Qin Shilai's face suddenly changed. His arms began to tremble slightly. The power from all directions was still converging towards him. His sword intent had reached an unprecedented peak. What he reincarnated was the sword intent of his ancestors. However, even though this sword intent had no charm, it was equally overbearing. At this time, the famous sword cutting edge, which was famous in Eastern Europe, could no longer bear the weight. A crack clearly appeared on the blade of cutting edge. In an instant, nearly half of the sword energy in the sky suddenly dissipated. Jiang Qiansong, who was ecstatic, suddenly roared. The moment the shield dissipated on his body, a strong light burst out from all over his body. The strong light filled the night sky and completely enveloped Qin Shilai. Qin Shilai's sword intent broke out completely. Hundreds of elites attacked at the same time. The raging fire and thunder that shook the sky burst out completely. At the same time, the strong light around Jiang Qiansong also burst out. The strong light was extremely messy, flying everywhere in a trance. 30-meter mortal world, dreamland of heaven. This was also a defensive move in the 30-meter mortal world. But its main function was to escape. The strong light obscured everyone's sight. Every flying light and shadow seemed to become Jiang Qiansong. The formation of hundreds of elites of Shenyuan's swords suddenly became chaotic with the different targets of the attack. Jiang Qiansong, who had been waiting for this opportunity, ignored Black Ghost and turned away. The broken blade of cutting edge pierced into Jiang Qiansong's domain. The remaining sword energy rolled up wildly and spread wildly after breaking Jiang Qiansong's domain. But Jiang Qiansong had already rushed out of the encircled formation. At this moment, he was only 30 meters away from the sword intent. But it was as far away as the end of the world. Jiang Qiansong suddenly burst out laughing. He stopped in place for a moment and looked back, his eyes extremely resentful. Qin Shilai's face was gloomy. He was a perfect person and a perfect formation. But it was just because of a few flaws in the sword that this destined to be earth-shattering attack failed. Qin Shilai's face turned red. However, such an arrangement had only left some minor injuries on Jiang Qiansong. If Jiang Qiansong managed to escape, the so-called Dark Sword Master would truly lose all face. Boom! An extremely violent roar suddenly sounded in the distance. Before Jiang Qiansong had time to say anything, the entire remaining castle collapsed completely in an instant. The magnificent buildings standing on the mountainous area continued to collapse and shatter. The lights completely disappeared, and the bell tower in the castle collapsed in the night. Smoke and dust swept the night sky like a thick fog, and then disappeared in an instant. Or it should be said that it did not disappear. It was covered by darkness. A black tide of extreme darkness suddenly rushed out of the broken castle. The black tide smashed the entire castle with great fierceness, rushed up to the sky, blocked the moonlight, and surged. The black tide had already lost its power, but it still carried a kind of mysterious charm. The black tide rushed through Qin Shilai and the sword formation formed by the troops of Shenyuan sword. As if by instinct, Qin Shilai raised the sword edge again. The remaining charm and the remaining sword energy merged into one in an instant. It was natural and perfect. The black tide and the sword light completely dissipated. In the blurred vision, the illusory figure suddenly became extremely clear. He raised the sword and stabbed forward. Qin Shilai disappeared. The black tide also disappeared. There was only the sword that was stabbing forward in the whole world. It occupied his vision, his consciousness, and the whole world. Jiang Qiansong let out the most miserable scream in his life. After all, he walked out of the sword formation and got rid of the lock. So in the face of this sword, he did not hesitate at all and turned to run. The incomparably grand sword energy filled the sky and moved forward slowly. The whole mountain area trembled under this sword intent. The sword intent swept through the castle and the mountains, and the condensed hillside burst into smoke and dust in an instant. Streaks of dust were flying wildly in the whole mountain area, like a sandstorm suddenly rising in a world of ice and snow. As the storm passed, the smoke and dust filled the sky and raged on everything. Jiang Qiansong opened his domain and defended with all his might. He ran away desperately and did not even dare to look back. This was equivalent to the joint attack of 2 generations of chosen ones after hundreds of years. But obviously, neither of them was in a perfect state. The sword intent began to dissipate slowly. A woman's voice suddenly rang out in the midst of the blurry sandstorm. "Damn it!" With the voice, an incomparably terrifying force suddenly surged forward. The terrifying power created a whirlpool in the hazy sandstorm. The sword intent was getting fainter and fainter. The vortex of power trapped in the sandstorm suddenly flew out, forcibly squeezed back the vortex, which was getting smaller and smaller, and then exploded. Space and dust were flying all over the sky. A blurry space gradually returned to silence. Qin Shilai looked ahead with a gloomy face. Under the silent night sky, an incomparably enchanting and gorgeous figure stood there. She had blonde hair and was full of cold-killing intent and fighting intent. But Jiang Qiansong had disappeared. Qin Shilai's face suddenly twisted for a moment, and then he finally recognized the woman in front of him. The corner of his mouth moved, and he was about to speak. The woman in front of him had already clenched her fists and said in a cold tone, "Qin Shilai, how dare you attack me? You let Jiang Qiansong go." Qin Shilai suppressed the anger in his heart, and his voice was solemn. "So what? I'm here tonight. Whoever I want to live can live, and whoever I want to die must die." The woman's voice was arrogant and cold. She stared at Qin Shilai and said, "Do you want to live or die? What about you?" A hoarse voice suddenly sounded. It was a little weak, but extremely calm. "Do you want to live or die?" The woman suddenly turned around. A young figure covered in blood slowly walked out of the ruins of the castle. His body was shaking slightly, but his eyes were as bright as stars, sharp and bright. The woman narrowed her eyes and looked at him. Suddenly she laughed. Li Tianlan? Li Tianlan, who barely walked out of the castle, ignored him. He came to Qin Shilai and asked directly, "Who is this?" Li Tianlan, who barely walked out of the castle, ignored him. He came to Qin Shilai and asked directly, "Who is this?" "King Tong, Queen of Shadows, Grand Duke of England." Qin Shilai's voice was hesitant. There were 3 women on the world divine list. 2 of them could be said to be on their side. But only King Tong was not. But it was King Tong who came tonight. And it was King Tong in her heyday. Li Tianlan said, "Oh," and looked at King Tong. "You let Jiang Qiansong go? So what?" King Tong looked at Li Tianlan playfully and said, "I can do whatever I like. What can you do?" She paused for a moment and suddenly laughed like a blooming flower. "I heard that you are with Yuatong? Haven't you heard her say that? I'm her stepmother or godmother. Don't you call me auntie when you see me?" Li Tianlan looked at her calmly. After a long time, he said blandly, "Bring Jiang Qiansong back, and I won't make things difficult for you." "Are you talking to me?" King Tong tilted her head and chuckled. But her voice gradually turned cold. "Now, get out of Reki City in Eastern Europe, and I won't make things difficult for you. How about that?" "Just you?" Li Tianlan seemed to smile. "Just because I am, kill." In King Tong's arrogant voice, Li Tianlan suddenly shouted. In an instant, falling stars turned into a big spear flowing with silver light in his hand. Li Tianlan took out a turquoise hairpin with his other hand. He inserted the hairpin directly into the body of the falling stars. The huge silver sniper rifle suddenly burst out a dangerous and illusory light. The incomparably bright light enveloped King Tong and locked her in an instant. Li Tianlan's palm was on the trigger. King Tong's body was stiff, and she did not dare to move. She recognized that the gun in Li Tianlan's hand was a murderous weapon modified by the legend of Qin. She also recognized that the turquoise hairpin was Blue Sky Underworld. Both guns might be charging. But this madman was now using a murderous weapon as a bullet. He was going to destroy Blue Sky Underworld to kill her. Li Tianlan held the body of falling stars tightly. The huge body of the spear moved forward and nailed King Tong's forehead directly. Li Tianlan took a step forward expressionlessly, looked at King Tong and said calmly, "Kneel down." Chapter 449. Excluding the mountain shatterer that Tyrant used when the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed, tonight could be said to be the first time that a murderous weapon appeared on the battlefield of Eastern Europe. And there were two of them at the same time. Blue Sky Underworld. Falling stars. No one knew the characteristics of falling stars. But everyone knew that Blue Sky Underworld was still in the charging period. So Li Tianlan directly used Blue Sky Underworld as a bullet. The green hairpin disappeared in the huge silver gun. The hazy and mysterious silver light suddenly filled the sky and the earth. The silver falling stars began to tremble involuntarily. As long as Li Tianlan pulled the trigger, the youngest murderous weapon in the dark world would completely decompose Blue Sky Underworld in an instant, and then burst out an absolutely fatal power. The silver light shone in the night sky and turned into beams of light drifting between heaven and earth. Li Tianlan's power was great. The cold muzzle of the gun was pressed against King Tong's forehead, and the great force made King Tong's body completely lean back. Her perspective was completely tilted. In addition to the murderous weapon on her forehead, there was only the night sky, which looked vaguely beautiful in the silver light all over the sky in her sight. King Tong closed her eyes slightly and then opened them again. In an instant, the calmness in her golden eyes faded away, and they became extremely piercingly cold. Her leaning body straightened up little by little, and she stood in front of Li Tianlan with the murderous weapon on her forehead. Li Tianlan did not retreat. Under the two opposite forces, King Tong took a step back as a matter of course. But the silver muzzle was still fixed on her forehead. King Tong looked into Li Tianlan's eyes. Li Tianlan looked at her quietly. There was only an extremely pure emotion in his eyes. This kind of purity could be called calmness. It could also be interpreted as madness. "You want me to get out of Wulan's state?" Li Tianlan's tone was indifferent. The silver light burst out of his hand in an almost turbulent manner, covering the sky. The two murderous weapons began to gradually combine. Since there were murderous weapons in the dark world, no one had ever put a murderous weapon as a bullet in another murderous weapon. A murderous weapon was enough to protect a country. This was enough to deter an invincible realm expert. No one would be so extravagant. But just because no one had done it before didn't mean it was impossible. Murderous weapons were originally pure energy metals. If two murderous weapons were to combine and detonate together, the power would be unprecedented, and the consequences of doing so would undoubtedly be extremely serious. After this spear, Blue Sky Underworld was destined to disappear from the dark world. Falling stars would also be severely damaged, and the price to repair it would be extremely high. Such a huge price also represented the power of this spear. All murderous weapons would accumulate energy slowly over a long period of time. At this time, if Li Tianlan deliberately detonated Blue Sky Underworld at the cost of the complete destruction of Blue Sky Underworld, the power that erupted could even exceed that of the human emperor. Under such power, it was impossible for King Tong to escape. Li Tianlan held the silver spear with one hand and pointed at King Tong's forehead. His face gradually became a little ferocious. "You want me to get out of Wulan's state? Who do you think you are? You let Jiang Qiansong go? Who do you think you are?" King Tong's head kept shaking because of the spear. Her golden eyes became more and more demonic, and she stared at Li Tianlan. She was the queen of the Shadow Throne and had a supreme position in the entire European Union. The chaos in Eastern Europe was unanimously regarded by all the wealthy families in the Shadow Throne as the best opportunity for them to occupy Eastern Europe and annex the four families. King Tong was full of confidence on this trip. Eastern Europe and Western Europe. In the vast Europe, The entire dark world of Europe could be said to have been occupied by the Polar Ground Alliance and the Shadow Throne. The recent generations of leaders of the Polar Ground Alliance were not happy. This superpower jointly supported by the four families could be said to be the puppets of the four families. It was restrained by the four families above, countless wealthy families below, and the governments of Eastern Europe beside it. Therefore, the Polar Ground Alliance, which occupied Eastern Europe, was not free. The Shadow Throne was also not free. It was an institution very similar to the Polar Ground Alliance, but it was far more mature than the Polar Ground Alliance. The Shadow Throne was not a puppet in the hands of the super wealthy families and governments. It had successfully found its own position, a very high position, in all classes in Western Europe, which was far more developed than Eastern Europe. But the Polar Ground Alliance was not a king. Prosperity often meant chaos. Western Europe, which was full of powerful countries, had always been at the center of the struggle in the Dark World. There were the Shadow Throne, the Vatican, the Dark Knights, and Knights Templars. All the superpowers in the world had their own bases in Western Europe. Everyone even thought that the secret headquarters of the Samsara Palace was also in Western Europe. Everyone wanted to be the only one who was strong. But no one had enough power. So every force was waiting for an opportunity. In the chaos in Eastern Europe, the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed, Tyrant disappeared, and the four families lost the solid barrier in front of them. In the eyes of all the superpowers in the world, the whole of Eastern Europe had become a place where storms and opportunities were brewing. In everyone's mind, Eastern Europe meant different interests and status. In the Shadow Throne's mind, they would absorb everything left after the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance and assimilate all of Eastern Europe in the shortest time with the most similar operation mode. At that time, their power in Europe could even suppress the Vatican. This was what all the wealthy families in the Shadow Throne were looking forward to. Their queen, Qingtong, was not at the top of the world divine list. But behind her throne was the full support of several developed countries and ancient wealthy families in Western Europe. What made Qingtong more confident was their allies. He had used the full power of the murderous weapon, Indefinite Grace, in exchange for an absolutely powerful ally. The Wang family of Beihai. The cooperation between the two could no longer be described as a simple alliance of the strong. Therefore, Qingtong could not think of any reason for her failure. Perhaps the only thing she had not thought of was why the chaos in Eastern Europe had changed so quickly. The expected long stalemate did not occur. Zhongzhou State used their youngest and sharpest young marshal to restart the Snowdance Corps. The young marshal and the army shocked the entire Dark World on the first day they arrived in Eastern Europe. The 5 Eastern European countries, the Jiang family of South America, and the Snowdance Corps were all involved in a chaotic battle in an instant. Qingtong didn't even have time to prepare anything. But the foundation of the Shadow Throne was enough for her to kill her way to Wulan State alone. The current situation was chaotic. But Qingtong was sure of one thing. No matter who won, the Jiang family of South America or the Snowdance Corps, the winner would not be easy. If she was fast enough, she'd become a paragon. She'd be strong enough to clean up the mess. No one tried to stop her. Even the Shadow Throne's most powerful ally this time was included. Wulan State might not be a big deal. But the 5 nearby countries centered on Wulan State were extremely sensitive. Controlling this place was basically equivalent to taking over 1/3 of Eastern Europe. With such huge benefits, Qingtong could not hesitate at all. She came quickly, and the current scene was within her expectations. The Jiang family of South America failed. Qin Shilai was injured. Li Tianlan was seriously injured. Everything was in line with her expectations. But she did not expect that Li Tianlan had murderous weapons in his hands. And they were 2 murderous weapons. This meant that at this time, as long as Li Tianlan was ruthless enough, as long as he dared to destroy a murderous weapon, he didn't even need any combat capability. As long as he pulled the trigger, the Queen of the Shadow Throne would be turned into ashes in an instant. The feeling of death was so cold, with such a huge surprise and humiliation that Qingtong's brain went blank again and again. Li Tianlan. Qingtong gnashed her teeth, one word at a time. Her teeth were very white, and the corners of her mouth were red. Even if she was extremely angry, she still had a very enchanting beauty. I'll repeat it again. Li Tianlan's tone was indifferent. Kneel down or I'll shoot you to death. His palm was steady, and his voice was even more determined. Since you let Jiang Qiansong go, you can die for him. Do you dare? King Tong suddenly laughed. The humiliation in her heart was suppressed to the deepest part of her heart in an instant. She smiled calmly, which made her look even more beautiful. Li Tianlan's eyes suddenly flashed with an extremely dangerous sharpness. I'm Yuetong's stepmother. People like you don't care, do they? In the heart of people like you, for your hegemony, you don't even care about Yuetong, do you? King Tong's tone was calm. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth and didn't speak, but his eyes obviously became colder. Yuetong can't stop you. King Tong said calmly, but what about Yuetong's father? Li Tianlan's pupils suddenly contracted, and his hand holding the murderous weapon suddenly tightened. Tianzong will show up here soon. He will represent Beihai and even Zhongzhou State to discuss cooperation with Rothschild and the Shadow Throne. As for the content of the cooperation, Marshal Li is not qualified to know, but I can tell you that the content of our cooperation is how to use Wulan State to expand the influence of Zhongzhou State and the Shadow Throne in Eastern Europe. Thank you for your fighting and contribution in Wulan State, Marshal Li. I'm willing to apologize for my inappropriate words before. King Tong smiled like a flower. Her smile was light and soft without any mockery, but it was extremely cold in Li Tianlan's ears. I think Rothschild and Beihai will never forget what Marshal Li has done in Wulan State in the future. I'm sorry and I'm very grateful. So, now, should I take this thing in your hand? Qin Shilai clearly heard every word of King Tong. His face gradually became serious. Wang Tianzong represented Zhongzhou State and Beihai to discuss with Rothschild how to use Wulan State. Li Tianlan was now the youngest highness in Zhongzhou State and had a high position and power. But in terms of weight, how could he compare with Wang Tianzong? At least Li Tianlan could represent the Snowdance Corps now. But in front of Wang Tianzong, in front of any invincible realm expert in Zhongzhou State, he could not represent Zhongzhou State. If Li Tianlan really withdrew from Wulan State under pressure, how should the relatives who were neighbors of the 5 Eastern European countries deal with themselves? Qin Shilai subconsciously glanced at Li Tianlan. He found that Li Tianlan was smiling. His smile was obviously undisguised, and even his body was trembling. But he did not put down the gun pointing at King Tong, and his arm holding the gun was still stable. An indescribable shock and anger rose in Li Tianlan's heart, rushed straight to his mind, and even occupied all his reason. When he was fighting for his life in Wulan State, when he was facing the whole international pressure in Wulan State, when he was fighting with the Jiang family of South America to the death in Wulan State, Zhongzhou State had been silent. Now the situation was gradually becoming clear. King Tong was coming. Wang Tianzong was also coming. He was going to discuss cooperation with King Tong in Wulan State on behalf of Zhongzhou State. Cooperation in Wulan State, which he and the Snowdance Corps had conquered. F***ck. Why? Since Marshal Li isn't tired, then raise your gun. But later, His Majesty the Sword Emperor may discuss the handover with you. I should probably avoid it. You think I will leave, don't you? Li Tianlan suddenly interrupted King Tong. King Tong's face froze for a moment and she looked at Li Tianlan. Just because he is the Sword Emperor, just because he can represent Zhongzhou State better than me. Li Tianlan's tone was soft and strange. So as long as he says something, I will give you Rekvia, which I have conquered, and Wulan State, which I have conquered, right? I will get your thanks and then get out of Wulan State with your thanks. Do you think so? You, King Tong frowned. Li Tianlan was still smiling. This family, this city, this country, it was me and my army that fought for it. My army is still on the way. I can conquer Rekvia, and my army can conquer the entire Wulan State. What can you and Wang Tianzong conquer? Every drop of blood and every life of me and the Snowdance Corps is not for your thanks. Do you think that Wang Tianzong can take away Wulan state by saying that he represents Zhongzhou state? Do you really think I'm dead? I can tell you now that I'm standing here. This place belongs to the Snowdance Corps, not to the Wang family of Beihai, nor to the Shadow Throne. As long as I'm alive, who can or can't let me leave Wulan state? Because you, King Tong, are not qualified. Wang Tianzong is not qualified either. From now on, this is a city controlled by the Snowdance Corps. As the queen of a foreign force, why do you think I dare not kill you? Wang Tianzong? King Tong's face suddenly changed. She took a step back subconsciously and opened her mouth. Shut up. Li Tianlan sneered. The falling stars moved, and the cold muzzle, which was shining with silver light, retreated a little and directly stabbed into King Tong's mouth. The cold muzzle almost stabbed into King Tong's throat in an instant, blocking all her words. You can live a little longer. Li Tianlan said calmly. His Majesty the Sword Emperor is coming, right? I'll wait for him. King Tong's body trembled involuntarily. It was not until this moment that she was completely sure that the youngest marshal of Zhongzhou state was not only amazing in spirit. He was a complete lunatic. Li Tianlan held the gun and looked into the distance. A female voice came from afar. It was clear, soft, and smiling. Your Highness is completely right. The sacrifice of the Snowdance Corps can't be replaced by a few words from some people. On behalf of the Vatican, Angel is willing to fully support Your Highness and Zhongzhou state in gaining a foothold in Eastern Europe. The voice was far away and sounded a little ethereal. But before he finished speaking, another voice sounded. The voice was very close, and it sounded completely beside Li Tianlan. Whether Zhongzhou state can gain a foothold in Eastern Europe or not, when does it need the support of the Vatican? The clear and indifferent voice was neither fast nor slow, but it instantly covered the entire mountaintop. Li Tianlan suddenly turned his head. Less than 10 meters away from him, the silent space fluctuated silently and almost imperceptibly for a moment. An ordinary figure slowly appeared beside Li Tianlan. He glanced at Li Tianlan and said quietly, "Do you think it's necessary?" Li Tianlan subconsciously tightened his body. And the group of people who had appeared on the mountainside in the distance also subconsciously paused. The atmosphere was still quiet, but the ruins of the entire castle suddenly became like facing a formidable enemy. Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State. Wang Tianzong. Li Tianlan held the gun and remained motionless. After a long time, he nodded calmly. "Greetings, Your Majesty." His voice was flat, but he did not loosen his grip on the gun at all. The muzzle was still stuffed in King Tong's mouth. King Tong did not dare to speak. Wang Tianzong nodded and did not look at King Tong. He just looked down the mountain with Li Tianlan. After a pause, the people at the foot of the mountain finally came up. The leader was a woman in white with her face covered in a veil. She was graceful, dignified, and holy. She slowly came to Li Tianlan, but ignored Wang Tianzong. She just bowed slightly to Li Tianlan and said with a soft smile, "I'm Angel from the Vatican. Greetings, Your Highness." "Why are you here, Holy Virgin?" Li Tianlan's tone was calm. "I just want to explain something to Your Highness." Because of Wang Tianzong's existence, Angel's words were simple and concise. She turned slightly, pointed to the gloomy chaos beside her, and said softly, "Your Highness, this is His Highness Chaos, the head knight of Knights Templars. I have learned in detail about the raid on the Samsara Palace by Knights Templars and the Jiang family of South America. I can swear by my faith that in this matter, the Knights Templars have never slaughtered the garrison of Zhongzhou State. All this has nothing to do with us. Of course, we have the sincerity to resolve this unpleasant misunderstanding, and we will express our apologies at the appropriate time." Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and looked at Chaos. Chaos's face changed for a while. Under Angel's gaze, he finally took a slow step forward, bowed deeply to Li Tianlan, and said in a dry voice, "Please forgive me, Your Highness. Divine Emperor of 9 Heavens." Chapter 450. In front of His Majesty, Chaos asked Your Highness to forgive him. With just one action, the Vatican's position had been completely clearly expressed. This should have been a matter of a lot of persuasion. But Wang Tianzong came quickly. So on such an occasion, it became a matter of a few words. Li Tianlan was not a fool. Neither was Wang Tianzong. No one was a fool. So the people present instantly understood what the entire Vatican was trying to express. Wang Tianzong slowly narrowed his eyes, still looking calm. Li Tianlan was thoughtful. He looked at Chaos, who had almost bent to the ground in front of him, and remained calm. Jiang Chenyan. Black Devil. Chaos. 3 experts on the holy list. In one day, 2 of them lay dead in front of him, and 1 bowed his head in front of him. This action represented not only the position of the Vatican, but also Li Tianlan's future interests. In fact, just a bow from Chaos in front of him was enough to boost his prestige. Chaos was the chief knight of Knights Templars. And Knights Templars was the spokesman of the Vatican in the dark world. It was self-evident how noble Chaos's identity was. Li Tianlan didn't speak, just glanced at Angel slightly. Angel stood there quietly, the night breeze blowing. Looking at the white veil on her body, the saintess behind the white veil seemed to smile. Knights Templars and the Vatican can jointly issue a life statement, emphasizing our friendly relationship with the Snowdance Corps, Zhongzhou State, and Arctic Ocean Command. Knights Templars can apologize to Zhongzhou State. Your Highness, I can assure you on behalf of the Vatican that as long as you are still in Eastern Europe, the Vatican and Knights Templars will be your most reliable friends. Li Tianlan didn't care about friends. He didn't even care if the other party was reliable. Because everyone knew that it was nonsense. What he cared about was the huge impact that the Snowdance Corps and the Vatican would bring in a short period of time. Wulan State was extremely important to him. If he could control the 5 Eastern European countries around Wulan State, he would almost control nearly 1/3 of the power in Eastern Europe. Such an achievement meant too many things in Zhongzhou State. Eastern Europe was huge. So when Eastern Europe was in chaos, everyone wanted a piece of the pie. But there were not many madmen who had to take down all of Eastern Europe. With the 5 Eastern European countries near Wulan State, Li Tianlan was equivalent to controlling a bridge from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. To this extent, Zhongzhou State could be said to be one of the winners of the chaos in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan would be much more relaxed next. He could attack and defend at will. With such an advantage, he would never retreat just because of Wang Tianzong's so-called gratitude. But not retreating required strength. The Bayou country's Qin clan was considered a force. If they could form an alliance with the Vatican, it would also be a form of strength. This could be said to be the sincerity of the Vatican. However, no sincerity could be given unconditionally. Li Tianlan admitted that he, a young man who had not entered the invincible realm, could not afford a bow from the chief knight of Knights Templars. If the church gave a lot, they would definitely take a lot as well. But that was not the most important thing. What mattered was that he had something to talk about with the Vatican. Qin Shilai pulled Li Tianlan's sleeve quietly. Wang Tianzong was here. King Tong was here. Angel is here. They were all familiar faces. Qin Shilai felt really embarrassed standing here. Li Tianlan nodded slightly, looked at Chaos, and said calmly, Knights Templars and the Jiang family of South America jointly raided the garrison base of Zhongzhou State. Forgiveness? How can I forgive him? He was now the marshal of Zhongzhou State. So he could not mention the Samsara Palace on the surface. Chaos bent over, did not get up, and did not respond. The deputy commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps who came with me has gone to track down Jiang Qiansong. If there is a chance, the deputy commander of Mellad will kill Jiang Qiansong. This is the sincerity of the Vatican and Knights Templars. Angel said calmly and elegantly. Li Tianlan smiled and was silent for a long time. Chaos still maintained the bowing posture that was a little humiliating for him, as if he had become a statue. Get up. After a long time, Li Tianlan said slowly. During the whole process, he did not look at Wang Tianzong, nor did he ask for the opinion of the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State. Thank you for your forgiveness, Your Highness. Angel smiled softly. As the veil fluttered, she looked peerless. Wang Tianzong looked around, his eyes paused on King Tong, and then he suddenly laughed. Tianlan, when can you represent Zhongzhou State? Wang Tianzong asked softly. Li Tianlan glanced at him and said, if I remember correctly, His Majesty recommended me to lead the army to the north. At the end of the meeting, I could represent Zhongzhou State. Wang Tianzong nodded and said, you can indeed deal with some things on behalf of Zhongzhou State. But it doesn't mean that you can handle everything. The relationship between Zhongzhou State and the Vatican is related to national policy. It's not just a matter of Eastern Europe. How can it be decided by you? Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and looked at Wang Tianzong. His voice was soft and gentle, and he said lightly, I will report this matter to the Hidden Dragon Sea and the Decision-Making Committee. I think they will agree with my way of dealing with it. You don't have to worry about it, Your Majesty. Wang Tianzong was silent for a moment. His eyes were as deep as the sea in an instant. Li Tianlan looked at him quietly. An undetectable pressure kept shrouding him. Li Tianlan's expression was calm, but the sweat on his back was getting more and more. It seeped into the wound and stung. After a long time, Wang Tianzong opened his mouth lightly. His voice was still unhurried, and it seemed to be the same as before. But Li Tianlan was keenly aware that there was something more in his tone. There was a little more factor that he couldn't capture at the moment. They may agree. Zhongzhou State may agree. Wang Tianzong said indifferently, but he paused and said, I don't agree. In an instant, everyone's hearts sank. Wang Tianzong was the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State and was qualified to call himself I. But in the past many years, he rarely used this word. Only a few people knew that every time he used this word, his emotions had surged to a certain extent. Or anger, or emotion, or self-mockery, or something else. But when this word came out of his mouth, it only represented one emotion. That was determination. Li Tianlan finally realized what the subtle thing in Wang Tianzong's tone that he couldn't capture was. That was majesty. The real, superior, and irresistible majesty. This feeling was very faint, but when it surged, it was like a completely surging and roaring deep sea, with a kind of power to destroy everything. Wang Tianzong's eyes fell on chaos. Chaos had stood up. But in an instant, he couldn't look directly at Wang Tianzong's eyes. It was calm all around, the night was deep, the moonlight was cold, and the stars were lonely. Chaos's body began to tremble for no reason. He was the knight with the strongest faith in the Vatican. That was why he became the chief knight of Knights Templars. He was an invincible realm expert at the top of the holy list. That was why he became the spokesman of the Vatican in the Dark World. But at this moment, the boundless coldness suddenly fell on him as Wang Tianzong's eyes fell on him. He didn't know what happened. But he instinctively felt fear. Fear became his only emotion. It's a fact that we joined hands with the Jiang family of South America to attack the garrison of Zhongzhou State. Facts can't be changed by any statement, nor can sincerity make up for it. Wang Tianzong said lightly, a sin is a sin. Zhongzhou State can forgive it. Marshal Li can forgive it. But I won't forgive it. The moonlight all over the sky seemed to dim for a moment. The light converged to the sky. But the cold moon in the sky was getting brighter. Light and darkness seemed to alternate for a moment. A breeze blew in front of Wang Tianzong. The breeze came from afar and fell from a high place. It blew over the dust of the ruins, the dry grass, the night sky, and chaos. It was silent. Chaos's body suddenly stiffened in place. He stared at Wang Tianzong. There was only fear left in his eyes. Wang Tianzong's eyes were calm and indifferent. The wind was a little stronger, with a chill that could penetrate into the bone marrow. In everyone's sight, Chaos's body began to disintegrate silently. Clothes, weapons, armor, flesh, internal organs, and bones. They all collapsed into ashes. The dust in the sky was blown away by the wind. Chaos disappeared. There was no blood in the field, no sword intent fluctuation, and even the hay under Chaos's feet was intact. It was as if he had never been here before. He turned into dust and disappeared from the world without a trace. Qin Shilai's face changed dramatically. Angel's body was completely stiff, and she opened her mouth subconsciously. You, Puff. A mouthful of blood flowed out of her mouth as she spoke, dyeing the white gauze red. Several saint warriors who followed her took a step forward in rage. There seemed to be nothing in the air. However, the bodies of several warriors seemed to have collided with countless swords and knives. Their flesh and blood were scattered all over the sky. Before they fell to the ground, they had been blown into ashes by the breeze. Are you familiar with it? Wang Tianzong suddenly glanced at Qin Shilai and asked. Qin Shilai's eyes were bitter, but he could not speak. The sword intent that filled heaven and earth silently enveloped the entire mountain area. Qin Shilai could not speak now, or even blink. In this state, as long as he opened his mouth, he would be seriously injured by the sword intent. If he moved rashly, he would end up like the warriors just now. All things turned to ashes. This was almost close to the peak state of all things turned to ashes. Only Li Tianlan could not feel the sword intent around him. Wang Tianzong's sword intent completely bypassed Li Tianlan and did not bring him the slightest threat. It was not because he was powerful. It was because he was the marshal of the Snowdance Corps of Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan held falling stars in his palm, and the muzzle that was directly inserted into King Tong's mouth kept moving forward. He looked at Wang Tianzong with indifference in his eyes. Put down the gun. Wang Tianzong said slowly, we'll discuss the matter of Wulan State later. But I want to take King Tong away. Li Tianlan took a deep breath, suppressed the restlessness in his heart, and said calmly, why? Zhongzhou State and Rothschild have always had a lot of cooperation. Cooperating with Rothschild to occupy Wulan State is the best result for Zhongzhou State, unless you want to be like what happened more than 20 years ago, when all the Western European countries joined hands, and the Li family at its peak had to compromise. Do you think you can go against the natural order? Wang Tianzong looked at Li Tianlan and said in a concise tone, let her go. Li Tianlan's tone was so calm that it was almost numb. There was no fluctuation in his voice, although his heart was surging to the extreme. Zhongzhou State has cooperation with Rothschild. But it doesn't mean that Rothschild and the Shadow Throne can threaten the marshal of Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan suddenly laughed. His eyes were shining, and the light was flowing, full of determination. I'll borrow a word from your majesty just now. Now that King Tong is in my hands, I don't want to let her go, so even if the whole Zhongzhou State agrees that you can take her away. But I don't agree. His hand that was holding the gun became extremely stable in an instant. As King Tong's eyes suddenly widened, he gently pressed his finger down and pulled the trigger in an instant. The trigger fell a little. But there was no gunshot. All the power was concentrated on Li Tianlan's finger. But the trigger that fell a little couldn't be pulled no matter what. The silver light all over the sky was flashing and rioting, but the silent sword intent completely isolated the silver light. The silver light was shining, but it couldn't be concentrated. The all-encompassing sword intent almost froze all Li Tianlan's movements in an instant. Wang Tianzong slowly moved forward and held the muzzle of falling stars. He pulled the muzzle out of King Tong's mouth little by little. Li Tianlan didn't move. He couldn't even move a finger. Wang Tianzong touched King Tong's hair and took her hand. He looked at Li Tianlan and said calmly, you have the right and qualification to disagree. But I'm here, and I forbid you to shoot. How can you shoot? Chapter 451. Li Tianlan couldn't answer Wang Tianzong's question. The indistinct but extremely heavy and majestic sword intent confined him where he was. Li Tianlan couldn't move or speak. He stood in a stiff posture holding the gun. The only thing that could move was his eyes. A pair of eyes as calm as water. Wang Tianzong saw thinking in this pair of eyes. In this state, Li Tianlan was like a statue. The surrounding wind blew slowly. The surrounding air suddenly became extremely thick. The curtain of night seemed to be glowing. It was faintly discernible and intermittently visible. It was a very obscure glimmer, but it carried a kind of radiance that was enough to illuminate the cold moon. Only the sun could illuminate the cold moon. Wang Tianzong was the sun. The only sun in this era shone brightly. Li Tianlan quietly looked at the thick and obscure space around him. He suddenly felt a little ridiculous. Jiang Qiansong claimed to be the best in defense in the Dark World. This fact might be true before Wang Tianzong broke through. But in the headquarters of Samsara Palace, Wang Tianzong almost lifted the whole deep sea alone. The sword intent of tens of thousands of meters crossed the sky and destroyed everything. In this state, Wang Tianzong had vaguely broken through the peak of the invincible realm and was only half a step away from the real chosen one. In this state, Wang Tianzong was really close to perfection. His path was not only light, but darkness as well. Day and night alternated. Defense and offense were both multiplied explosively. This was the current Wang Tianzong. It could be done without batting an eyelid, or it could be earth-shattering. Li Tianlan could not even tell whether the space that suppressed and confined him was sword intent or domain. In terms of the martial arts of the Wang family of Beihai, there was not much difference between sword intent and domain when they reached the extreme, because the core essence of their martial arts was outbreak. This space, which was like a sword intent or a domain, firmly suppressed him. Li Tianlan's eyes moved and he looked at Wang Tianzong coldly. He could roughly understand Wang Tianzong's state at this time, but he could not break Wang Tianzong's current sword intent. The realm gap between them was too big. As Wang Tianzong said, Li Tianlan could not do anything if he did not allow him to do it. Under such a gap, Li Tianlan was not even qualified to fight desperately. The sword intent surrounded him. Li Tianlan's figure was stiff and he could not even move. How could he fight desperately? Wang Tianzong glanced at Li Tianlan and suddenly said, "Apologize." King Tong, who had struggled back from the edge of death, was uneasy. She glanced at Li Tianlan and thought to herself, "This lunatic can't move or speak. How can he apologize?" She wanted to remind Wang Tianzong, but as soon as she raised her head, she found that Wang Tianzong's eyes fell on her. King Tong suddenly understood, and her hand, which was held by Wang Tianzong, suddenly tightened. Wang Tianzong didn't mean that Li Tianlan should apologize to her. Instead, he wanted her to apologize to Li Tianlan. King Tong suddenly felt extremely angry. This kind of anger combined with the fear just now made her look very complicated. At that moment, King Tong was sure that if it weren't for Wang Tianzong, she would have been killed by Li Tianlan's spear. The feeling of brushing past death made her sweat all over, and her heart was still pounding. In a state of shock, Wang Tianzong asked her to apologize to Li Tianlan. She looked at Wang Tianzong in a daze. She looked at the man she had loved for many, many years. Wang Tianzong's expression was calm, and peaceful. King Tong suddenly smiled self-deprecatingly. Tonight, it could be said that she was humiliating herself. She came here as a dominator, let Jiang Qiansong go, and angered Li Tianlan. Wang Tianzong saved her. But there had to be an explanation for this matter. Li Tianlan was no longer the young man a few years ago or even a few days ago. Now Li Tianlan was His Highness and the youngest marshal in the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State. Wang Tianzong could save her life by virtue of the cooperation between Beihai, Zhongzhou State, and Rothschild. But she had to show her attitude. Apologize. Wang Tianzong repeated it again. King Tong bit her lip, and her face was a little pale. She should apologize for not suppressing Li Tianlan for what happened today. This was a normal thing. She knew that Wang Tianzong had considered a lot, but she didn't know what he had considered. After all, he didn't care. If he didn't care, how could he like her? King Tong took a slow step forward. She really didn't know what Wang Tianzong was thinking when he asked her to apologize. Was it the overall situation? Cooperation? Interests? Politics? Future prospects? From his standpoint, this was indeed a question he should consider. But King Tong still felt a little wronged. Because she knew very well that she was the one standing here today, so she needed to apologize to Li Tianlan. But if it was Summer Solstice standing here today, even if it was wrong, even if it was inappropriate, even if it was not for the overall situation, Wang Tianzong would not let Summer Solstice bow. King Tong walked up to Li Tianlan and bowed deeply. The moment she bent down, the whole sky seemed to dim completely. Her voice was a little hoarse and hollow. "Please forgive me, Your Highness." The surrounding space became dimmer and dimmer. King Tong stared straight at the ground and at Li Tianlan's military boots. The sticky space slowly drifted away. Li Tianlan's calm and indifferent voice sounded. He looked at Wang Tianzong and said calmly, "This sword stroke is very powerful." Wang Tianzong raised his eyebrows. Then, Li Tianlan's voice sounded again. "But it's not enough. For this era, this sword stroke is enough." Wang Tianzong said, "Nothing can break it, but it's indestructible. How is it not enough?" Nothing could break it. It was an absolute defense. It was indestructible. It was an ultimate attack. Li Tianlan laughed. "Nothing can break it?" He said calmly, "I want to have a try." Wang Tianzong subconsciously narrowed his eyes. It seemed to be the reappearance of chaos before its fall. Li Tianlan looked at King Tong and said calmly, "Forgive me? You let Jiang Qiansong go, and half of the painstaking efforts of the Snowdance Corps and the Qin clan have been destroyed. How can you forgive me?" In the increasingly subtle and dark space, Li Tianlan's voice seemed to be far away. I won't forgive you." Crack! The sound of space shattering rang out without warning. Li Tianlan, who could not move at all, directly raised his right hand. The whole world suddenly became extremely quiet. The world was quiet. In the absolute silence and nothingness, the mountains, rivers, and the world seemed to shrink in an instant, and everything in the world fell silent in an instant. Nothingness. Desolation. But it was extremely real. In the real world, an illusory sword light appeared. The sword light was ethereal and condensed. It was neither fast nor slow, but it could not be stopped. Because in the real world, speed had no meaning at all. Sword light. Sword energy. Sword intent. It kept falling down. Li Tianlan stretched out his hand and pointed at King Tong. In an instant, reality and illusion began to alternate. The world was a void. The sword energy that rose into the sky became the only eternal thing in an instant. The fiercest sword. The most real sword. The space was broken. The sword intent was broken. Wang Tianzong's sword intent was completely torn apart with the broken space, forming ripples one after another. Wang Tianzong frowned slightly. Countless viscous spaces suddenly enveloped King Tong. Li Tianlan's arm was like a sword, and he slowly pointed over. The space, which was thick enough to completely imprison an invincible realm expert, was shattered in an instant. Nothing could break it? This sentence was like a joke under Li Tianlan's sword. Wang Tianzong's eyes had become completely serious. He raised his hand and gently pulled it back. King Tong's figure retreated wildly under the huge force. Tens of meters, hundreds of meters, hundreds of meters. Li Tianlan's fingers stretched out. The sword intent that shattered everything spread wildly, and in an instant, it had expanded to a kilometer away. Wherever the sword light passed, the hard ground and the void were completely torn apart. Li Tianlan pointed casually, and it seemed that he had directly pointed out a terrifying void that was thousands of meters long. Wang Tianzong frowned, took a step forward, and directly stood in front of Li Tianlan. Day and night suddenly alternated for a moment. The peace on Wang Tianzong's body faded away, and the majestic and domineering dark sword light bloomed in his hand in an instant. The two sword lights suddenly met at the shortest distance. It was like the collision of two peerless famous swords. In the sound of gold and iron colliding, the two sword lights collapsed as soon as they touched. Puff! A mouthful of blood sprayed directly from Li Tianlan's mouth. The vibration of the joints was extremely clear. Li Tianlan could even clearly feel that there were cracks on the bones of his arms, which were almost completely broken. Dark red blood bloomed from Wang Tianzong's hands. His arms trembled uncontrollably, and he finally hid them behind him. Everyone looked at Li Tianlan with a shocked face. Qin Shilai was especially incredible. At the closest distance, Qin Shilai could completely confirm the power of Li Tianlan's sword just now. The absolute peak of the invincible realm. And it was the top peak of the invincible realm sword intent. How could Li Tianlan become so strong? Wang Tianzong glanced at Li Tianlan, then looked past him and into the distance. He glanced over the ruins of the castle and cast his gaze into the dark mountain area in the distance. Wang Tianzong was silent for a long time before he slowly said, "How dare you borrow this sword strike?" Li Tianlan tried hard to swallow the blood in his mouth. He said calmly, "My sword is here. There's nothing to hide." Wang Tianzong smiled and commented rudely, "Stupid." Li Tianlan sneered and said nothing. Of course, he had not reached the peak of the invincible realm. The sword strike just now, as Wang Tianzong said, was borrowed. His sword intent was flawless. But the sword energy was not that strong. So he used his sword intent to borrow an extremely powerful sword energy in the distance. In an instant, the sword energy and sword intent combined, and the power directly soared to the peak of the invincible realm. And at the price of this, Li Tianlan exposed a part of his martial arts to the other party. It was hard to say whether such a price was big or small. But there was another problem. If he wanted to make this sword strike almost compete with Wang Tianzong at the moment of borrowing the sword, such sword energy must be similar to Li Tianlan's own martial arts in some aspects. It could even be of the same origin. In the whole dark world, there were only 2 people who were qualified to lend sword energy to Li Tianlan except Wang Tianzong. Lin Fengting was not here. Then there was only one person who appeared here. Purgatory of Heaven Capital. Deity. It could only be deity. Wang Tianzong looked at the darkness in the distant mountains and was silent for a long time. Chapter 452. Li Tianlan was also silent for a long time. Everything in Wulan State was coming to an end as planned, but the closer it was to the end, the more lively the scene became. After tonight, the Jiang family of South America, which had no possibility of turning the tables, was destined to withdraw from the game in Eastern Europe. The Snowdance Corps forced the Jiang family of South America to retreat, but the scene was more complicated. On the day of death, Jiang Chenyan, Black Ghost, and Chaos died. Li Tianlan was seriously injured. Jiang Qiansong was seriously injured. Qin Shilai was seriously injured. After the night, Li Tianlan had to face the covetous eyes of the Wang family of Beihai and Rothschild. It was the Vatican with a subtle attitude. It was the pressure that was finally transmitted to Eastern Europe after the internal game of Zhongzhou State. The 5 Eastern European countries had no choice but to surrender. It was the hostility of the whole of Europe. All of the various superpowers were paying close attention to this matter. They were all the variables that might be caused after the Purgatory of Heaven Capital entered Wulan State. Li Tianlan's breath was a little heavy. These were all questions he had to consider. The man, the general, and the marshal all had their own standpoints. But as a paragon, he had to adjust his stance to the bigger picture. Every paragon had to deal with a problem like Li Tianlan. The one who was able to deal with all these complications as if they were light was the true ruler, or rather, the ambitious and ruthless person. Li Tianlan turned his head and looked back. There was only darkness in the distance. But the darkness was incomparably sharp and dense. Sword chi that was as majestic as the sky filled the darkness in the distance, like lightning hidden in the 9 heavens. It was hidden, but the entire horizon was filled with a sharpness that could tear everything apart. All Li Tianlan could see was the dark sword energy. The sword energy of the 24 moves of sword. The sword energy of the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan was the first to feel the sword energy. At first, this sword energy quietly converged in the sword intent around Li Tianlan, as small as a drop of water. It was not that Wang Tianzong could not find it. It was just that he didn't notice. That was why Li Tianlan borrowed deity's sword energy, combined it with his own sword intent, and went straight to the peak of the invincible realm. Li Tianlan could feel the initiative of this sword intent. But he also could not forget deity's undisguised killing intent towards him when he was in Tiandu. So why did God take the initiative to lend the sword? What was his motive? He slowly turned around. Wang Tianzong also withdrew his gaze. God still did not appear. In the majestic dark sword intent that almost filled the sky, Li Tianlan and Wang Tianzong's eyes met for a moment. Li Tianlan looked at Wang Tianzong thoughtfully. Wang Tianzong's eyes rested on Li Tianlan's hand, and he was also thoughtful. Li Tianlan held falling stars in his hand. There was also a primitive heaven underworld spring in the falling stars. Although the two guns were forced back by Wang Tianzong, they were still damaged to a certain extent. However, such damage was not a serious problem in the eyes of any superpower. Wang Tianzong's eyes became a little softer quietly. He smiled. There was no negative emotion in this smile. This feeling, are you and I enemies or friends? Wang Tianzong suddenly asked. Boundless emptiness and exhaustion eroded Li Tianlan's body and will. His body was still straight, and he said expressionlessly, the overall situation is the most important. Wang Tianzong nodded with a smile. He looked at Li Tianlan with appreciation in his eyes, but behind the appreciation there was a touch of killing intent. Two completely different ringtones rang at the same time. Li Tianlan and Wang Tianzong took out their mobile phones at the same time. Li Tianlan looked slightly surprised. He didn't know who was calling Wang Tianzong at this time, but the person who called his mobile phone at this time was a real big shot. Li Tianlan picked up the phone and said hello in a hoarse voice. You did a good job in Wulan State, and you made a name for yourself. It seems that Tianzong's recommendation of you at that time also had a positive effect. They were right about one thing. In the chaos, Zhongzhou State, as the strongest country, should have the spirit to match the strongest national strength. Comrade Tan, when you come back, I will celebrate for you. A gentle and smiling voice sounded from the other side of the phone. Li Tianlan's heart, which had always been tight, slowly relaxed. He was waiting for this call. Because Zhongzhou State had been silent on the international stage. Now this voice sounded in his ears. It would not be long before the voice of Zhongzhou State would be heard all over the world. This proved that the entire Zhongzhou State had a completely unified attitude. You flatter me, President. Li Tianlan's voice was soft and peaceful. On the other side of the phone, President Li Huaqing smiled and said intentionally or unintentionally, do you have some misunderstanding with Tianzong? There is no misunderstanding. Li Tianlan said indifferently, it's just that the Snowdance Corps has dyed Eastern Europe with blood, and the heroic souls of Zhongzhou State need a home. This is the elegy and glory of Zhongzhou State and the Snowdance Corps. Neither the Sword Emperor nor the so-called Queen can violate the will of the Snowdance Corps. His voice was indifferent and determined. This kind of words might be more effective in front of the entire Snowdance Corps. But after all, he was still changing, and what he was growing was not only martial arts. So there were some words that he still couldn't say in front of the Snowdance Corps. But in the face of Li Huaqing, Li Tianlan did not hesitate to show his attitude, leaving no room for retreat. Li Huaqing was silent for a while. Comrade Fang Qing is communicating with Tianzong. Tianlan, we know the grievances between Beihai and the Li family. But now you and Tianzong are the flags of Zhongzhou State in Eastern Europe. Everything is important, and you can't let others see you as a joke. Li Huaqing's tone was calm. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth and said, you ask him. He knows what's going on. This, he, naturally referred to Wang Tianzong. Li Huaqing said yes, a little confused. Li Tianlan did not explain, but said blandly, before dawn, the flag of the Snowdance Corps will fly in the center of the capital of Wulan State, and I will raise the flag myself. He hung up the phone casually. The meaning of this sentence was already very obvious. He would hang the flag of the Snowdance Corps in the center of the capital of Wulan State. Even in the face of the Sword Emperor and the Queen, he would not give in. Wang Tianzong also hung up the phone at the same time. He glanced at Li Tianlan, slowly turned around, and walked in the direction of Qingtong. I will stay in Wulan State recently. He said. Staying in Wulan State meant that he would not retreat. His voice was very soft. But with the sudden breeze, it spread throughout the night in an instant. Li Tianlan did not express any opinion on this, but said blandly, you should thank me. Wang Tianzong did not look back, but said calmly, it should be the people around you who should thank you. He passed by Angel, the Holy Virgin of the Vatican, and glanced at her. If the Vatican is dissatisfied, let the Pope come to me in person. Beihai, Eastern Europe, or the Holy Land, I will wait for him. There was no wind in the night in the distance. But Wang Tianzong's voice came clearly from the ruins in the distance. Deity stood on the top of a steep mountain in the mountains. He was covered in black clothes and held a huge scythe that was 3 meters long in his hand. He watched the scene quietly. The overwhelming sword intent covered the mountains. He stood there in an incomparably real way, and the surrounding mountains became illusory. He watched the fight between Li Tianlan and Wang Tianzong at that moment. He saw the two of them pick up the phone. He saw Wang Tianzong turn around. He also heard Wang Tianzong's voice. Deity did not say a word, but the light in his eyes was full of indifference. Daybreak stood beside Deity and suddenly said, "He will stay in Wulan state recently. That's what I said to you." Deity did not respond. He did not even look at Wang Tianzong. He just looked at Li Tianlan quietly. After a long time, he slowly opened his mouth and said blandly, "Good for nothing." Daybreak smiled and said, "I think he is very calm and rational." Rationality is useless. Deity shook his head. Strictly speaking, this is not even a breath of resentment. He did not suffer a loss tonight. On the contrary, if he really did what you hoped, the next result would be unbearable for him and Zhongzhou state. Daybreak commented, "This is their overall situation." Deity did not speak. Daybreak also fell silent. Sometimes, sudden help wasn't kindness. At least Deity did not lend the sword just now out of kindness. Sometimes being stubborn and not giving in was not full of hostility. Wang Tianzong staying in Wulan state was not hostile. At that moment, Deity's sword energy and Li Tianlan's sword intent merged. In the instantaneous confrontation, only Deity could clearly feel that Li Tianlan deliberately interfered with Deity's sword energy with sword intent. Li Tianlan borrowed this sword strike. But he did not exert the full power of this sword strike. At that time, Wang Tianzong did not notice Deity's sword intent at all. So if Li Tianlan did not hold back, it was equivalent to a full sneak attack on Wang Tianzong by an expert at the peak of the invincible realm at a very close distance. King Tong would die without a whole body. Wang Tianzong would be seriously injured in an instant. And it would be a real serious injury. He might even die directly. The Marshal of Zhongzhou State made a sneak attack and killed the Sword Emperor of Zhongzhou State. If he joined forces with foreign forces, what was that? At that time, not to mention competing for the interests of Eastern Europe, there would be a great disturbance within Zhongzhou State. Zhongzhou State would withdraw from Eastern Europe in chaos. There were only two outcomes for Li Tianlan. Either he was killed by the seriously injured Wang Tianzong with a sword strike, or he would be exiled for life for treason. As for the Li family and the Dongqing clan, what greeted them could only be a huge disaster. In addition to seriously injuring or killing Wang Tianzong and becoming famous in the dark world, Li Tianlan had no benefits. It was Deity and the Purgatory of Heaven capital who benefited. The Purgatory of Heaven capital was very strong, and so was Deity. And he was in Eastern Europe now. Wang Tianzong was seriously injured. Li Tianlan died. Deity would not let go of Wang Tianzong. He would not let go of the two murderous weapons in Li Tianlan's hands. He would not give up Wulan State either. He killed his biggest opponent and got the two murderous weapons and the control of the 5 countries in Eastern Europe. If Li Tianlan really ignored the overall situation with that sword strike just now, what was in front of the Purgatory of Heaven capital at this time was all interests. What a pity, Deity sighed, and his voice was a little emotional. He really didn't expect Li Tianlan to be so calm and rational. An opportunity to seriously injure Wang Tianzong was in front of him. He could take action, but he couldn't. Everything was for the overall situation. If he took action with that sword strike just now, have you ever thought about the Li family in Zhongzhou State, Your Highness? Daybreak suddenly asked. His question was extremely sharp, but there was no guilt in Deity's tone, only calmness. The Li family in Zhongzhou State should be destroyed. Deity looked at Li Tianlan's back and said calmly, "The Li family has me. He should sacrifice for the Li family." Daybreak nodded and suddenly laughed. Maybe Li Tianlan thinks so too. Deity did not speak, but looked quietly at the ruins in the distance. Wang Tianzong, who was in the ruins, had walked far away and came to King Tong's side. He took King Tong's hand again and turned to look at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was also looking at him. The two looked at each other. It was an extremely strange but solemn picture. Deity looked at this picture and was speechless. Li Tianlan, Wang Tianzong. These two people basically represented the present and future of the dark world in Zhongzhou State. The present, the future, they were all shining. Like the scorching sun. Like the sun in the sky. Deity became more and more indifferent. He suddenly thought of the mysterious His Majesty. If the other party was also put in this picture in front of him, what role would that His Majesty play? Was it the present of Zhongzhou State? The future? Once. Chapter 453. Deity was looking at Li Tianlan and Wang Tianzong. Daybreak was looking at Deity and Li Tianlan. The cold wind at night in Eastern Europe finally returned to normal. Some faint lights gradually lit up in the desolate and dilapidated castle ruins. This picture was a little desolate and tragic. But it was beautiful. Deity, Li Tianlan, Wang Tianzong. The three of them stood in different positions, but they seemed to be connected in a line. Daybreak looked at this scene and suddenly had an indescribable strange feeling in his heart. This picture is very beautiful. Daybreak suddenly said. This sentence was very simple. But it was also very complicated. It contained many meanings. Deity glanced at him, slowly turned around, and calmly said, "There was an old guy who once said something." His body moved forward. As he moved forward, he moved the huge 3-meter-long sickle beside him. The cold light of the sickle reflected the moonlight and became sharper. But as God's body moved, a drop of blood suddenly dripped down and landed on the sharp and clear scythe. The drop of blood was dark red, and it was a shocking sight. Through Li Tianlan's sword intent and Wang Tianzong's sword, Deity pursed his lips tightly. So the blood turned into a thin line of blood, flowed down the corner of Deity's mouth, and fell on the blade of the sickle. Deity's voice was calm and stubborn. "Everything beautiful will be broken." Daybreak looked at the blood flowing down the blade, and his eyes were complicated and dignified. He didn't know who the old guy in Deity's mouth was. He also knew under what circumstances the Old Highness said this sentence. This was what the Old Highness said when he knew Deity's ambition for the Wang family of Beihai. It came from the bottom of his heart, but it was meaningful. Daybreak moved slowly with Deity and said calmly, "Wang Tianzong is stronger than 3 years ago." Deity nodded. His tone was still calm, without any negative emotions. But this is his limit. For this era, a half-step chosen one is indeed invincible. But if he can't take the last step, what can he do no matter how strong he is? "You're hurt," Daybreak said. What he said was a fact that could not be more obvious. In the final battle of Heaven Capital 3 years ago, Deity and Wang Tianzong were at the peak of the invincible realm at the same time. Wang Tianzong might be a little stronger, but it was almost negligible. But now was completely different from 3 years ago. Wang Tianzong had another breakthrough. In this state, Wang Tianzong was really half a step stronger than Deity. If you take action now and fight Wang Tianzong to the death, how confident are you? Daybreak asked. "I'm not sure." Deity shook his head. He stopped where he was and thought silently for a while. Then he continued, "In your opinion, what was the fundamental reason for the collapse of the Li family?" The problem was huge. The answer was well known. But sometimes, the answer that everyone knew was not necessarily correct. Daybreak looked at Deity and waited for his explanation. "It's not me who committed treason." God said, "Even if there is no case of treason, something else will happen. Maybe it will be something even more shocking. Maybe it will be some small things that add up and cause greater consequences." The root cause of the Li family's collapse was that the Li family was too strong and the old guy was too pedantic. Deity whispered, "So everyone in the world wants the Li family to be destroyed." Summer Solstice easily took advantage of people's hearts. She united with Kunlun City, the Jiang family of South America, and several other superpowers. At that time, the Wang family of Beihai was very dangerous and could be crushed by the Li family at any time. But when summer solstice looked for other superpowers to cooperate with, no one would demand an exorbitant price from the Wang family of Beihai because of its situation. Even the Jiang family of South America, which had always been hostile to the Wang family of Beihai, helped the Wang family of Beihai almost for free. Why? Because of the existence of the too strong Li family, no one wanted to see the Wang family of Beihai disappear. Even the hostile forces of the Wang family of Beihai didn't want to see this, because they knew very well that once the Li family annexed the Wang family of Beihai, they would not have a good end. Because the Li family was too strong, everyone in the world wanted to destroy it. Everyone in the world wanted to destroy the Li family. So the Li family was really destroyed. Daybreak vaguely seemed to know what deity meant. So now I have no confidence in Wang Tianzong. I'm not his opponent. But so what? Wang Tianzong is very strong, but not the strongest. The half-step chosen one is invincible in the world, but he doesn't have absolute dominance. How similar is the Wang family of Beihai in this state to the Li family in the past? In the past, the Li family was too strong, so people in the world wanted to destroy the Li family. Now Wang Tianzong is too strong, so people in the world want to kill the Sword Emperor. People in the world want to kill him. What does it matter if I'm not sure? He continued to move forward and said calmly, "Go to see Qin Weibai. I have a hunch that no matter what the situation of the Samsara Palace is in this chaos in Eastern Europe, Qin Weibai will give everyone a surprise." Actually, Daybreak hesitated for a moment. With Qin Weibai's assistance, Tianlan's future achievements will be unimaginable. "Your Highness, you, deity said in a deep voice. Daybreak gritted his teeth and continued, "So I think that Li Tianlan, with Qin Weibai by his side, is the greatest hope to support the Li family in the future." His voice calmed down. "So I don't understand why you always want to kill him. You even want to kill Qin Weibai. Wiping out the future hope of the Li family, are you reviving the Li family or destroying it? You don't understand." Deity shook his head. "The Li family with Li Tianlan is not what I want. When I returned to Zhongzhou State this time and faced the old guy in Lin, and I just wanted to tell him one thing." Deity laughed. Under the black clothes that covered his face, his voice and expression were extremely paranoid. His voice and expression were extremely paranoid. "The Li family is my Li family. It's also Li Tianlan's." Daybreak said calmly. He was Deity's real confidant and the person who knew him best, so he spoke casually and was not afraid that Deity would suddenly turn against him. Deity's tone was cold. "That's just what you think, no?" Daybreak sneered rudely and said, "Who doesn't think so except you? The Li family used to be yours, and now it's Li Tianlan's. The purgatory of heaven capital is yours now, and it will be Li Tianlan's in the future. Almost everyone regards him as the young master. Believe it or not, if you die in the chaos in Eastern Europe, Li Tianlan will take over the entire purgatory of heaven capital in the shortest time. This is the truth. What can you prove by saying no?" Deity suddenly stopped. In the dark night, he slowly turned around, looked in the direction of Li Tianlan, and was silent for a long time. "Wang Tianzong can't kill Li Tianlan, because Li Tianlan is the marshal of Zhongzhou State. He has scruples and restrictions. But you don't. Isn't the reason why you don't do it because you are hesitating? You are hesitating about the future of you and the Li family. You are not even sure about your future. How can you say that he is not?" Deity gently raised his hand. This action interrupted Daybreak's words. Countless sword intents suddenly surged in his hands. The darkness of thousands of meters around shrank wildly. Deity's eyes were cold. In front of the ruins of the castle, Li Tianlan suddenly turned back and looked at the darkness in the distance. Deity kept his hand raised and looked at Li Tianlan, but he did not make a move. But the sword intent all over Li Tianlan suddenly burst out. The sword intent alternating between reality and illusion rose to the sky. A vast and sharp sword light rushed in the direction of Deity in an instant. The night was roaring crazily. Li Tianlan's sword intent burst out, and the whole night sky seemed to suddenly have a surging river across the sky. Li Tianlan's eyes were extremely deep. For the first time since he became the combat capability of the invincible realm, he felt so small. Qin Shilai was also shocked. At this moment, no one knew how many experts were hidden in the ruins of the castle. It was like a replay of the battle between Li Tianlan and Wang Tianzong with the help of the sword. The sword energy and sword intent intertwined. In an instant, the sword that crossed the night sky was another attack of the peak of the invincible realm. But last time, Li Tianlan used his own sword intent to borrow deity's sword energy. This time, when deity was about to kill Li Tianlan, the sword energy suddenly surging in the night sky forcibly borrowed Li Tianlan's sword intent. At this moment, Li Tianlan was not the leader of this sword. Instead, he was completely protected by this huge and incredible sword energy. Li Tianlan knew this sword. Deity also knew this sword. At this time, the sword with the help of Li Tianlan's sword intent was one of the 24 moves of sword. 21st Blade Shatter of Land. 9 Heavens Divine Emperor, you're tuning in to the Wang Lin's Journey YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.